Welcome. Have a chair, please, and let me just say how grateful I am to see all of you here on a Friday. Nobody in Washington does anything on Fridays, you know? I mean, you know, this is one thing as a carryover from COVID is that we only work 4-day weeks here, okay, in Washington. But thankfully, and CSIS works every day, but thankfully we have this great opportunity to bring our Japanese friends together for what's going to be a very important conversation. I'm really grateful that we have this opportunity. KAZEKI-san, thank you. Really terrific that you're willing to give us this time. I think we're kind of riding on the, you know, the shadows of your conference out in Colorado, but thank you. Thank you for coming and being a part of it here. And Scott, thank you to you. You've been a pioneer on so much of space policy in Washington. And we're really grateful that you've given us this chance, this time to be with you. You know, this is going to be a conversation today that'll take place. There's going to be two dimensions to this. You know, the foundational dimension, obviously, is how we work together collaboratively on space. And that's really the reason we're here. And I want to say thanks to Kari Bingen. Kari has been tireless in trying to create opportunities for us to work with Japan on matters of space. And of course, Japan is a powerhouse. You know, gosh, you landed an exploration satellite on an asteroid, you know, drilled into it. Phenomenal. I watched that and it was so much fun. And, you know, you've got enormous talents. And it's a real opportunity for us to explore the opportunities for doing more together. And so that's the purpose that we're here to give. But there's another dimension to this. And that is for us to talk about what it's like for allies and partners to work together. You know, we've got some strange, weird headwinds here in Washington that are questioning whether America wants or needs allies or partners. And there's kind of an underlying sentiment that somehow we pay a price for having allies. You know, and that's just completely wrong. I mean, I've spent 40 years of my life trying to build relationship with Japan and partner countries. Why? Because it was important for us. I wasn't giving a gift. It was something I wanted for my own country. I wanted a partnership with Japan because I knew the talent that was there, the energy that was there. And for us now to be talking about this as though somehow there's a burden because we have allies, it's just wrong. We've allowed this kind of grievance, you know, mentality to enter into our politics here. There are people in America over the last 30 years that have suffered badly by our international economic policies. But it wasn't because of allies. It was because of we didn't do the job here to address the problems that were secondary to this great opportunity that we had by partnering with countries like Japan and creating this new world. You know, and I was with a bunch of, you know, I'll just say non-Americans. I don't want to call them foreigners because that's a terrible thing. Non-Americans over the last 2 days at an advisory board meeting for a corporation. And all of them said, you know, we don't understand what you're talking about. You know, you guys, if you look over the last 50 years, your per capita GDP improved over everybody else. You were the beneficiaries of this system. You weren't the victims. So what are we doing talking about this as though allies are a problem. Allies are the greatest benefit and opportunity we've ever had. So we're going to talk about space today. I'm sorry, I feel better. I got that off my chest, okay. I said what I wanted to say, and we now want to talk about space. But I do say there's a deeper background to this, and it's the crucial importance it is to have the opportunity to work with powerful, smart, sophisticated allies like Japan. And just to say, KAZEKI-san, you've been a leader, you don't look like you've been in business for 30 years, but I guess you've been in business for 30 years, and with METI, and now they put you in this position of leading the space agenda. And you're doing a remarkable job. It's really terrific. But it is emblematic of the depth of talent in Japan. And so today you're carrying, the image of all of Japan, of your technical competence, and we're really glad to have this opportunity to partner with you. So could I ask all of you, with your very warm applause, to welcome to the stage KAZEKI Jun, who's going to lead. He's going to really start this off for real. Okay, I'm just entertainment. Okay, please come on up here, Jun, please.
Thank you, Dr. John Hamle, the very kind word for me. And thank you, Kari, for organizing this event. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jun KAZEKI from the National Space Policy Secretariat of the Cabinet Office, Government of Japan. I would like to express my gratitude to CSIS for providing this precious opportunity of deepening discussions on Japan-U.S. space security relationship. Earlier this week, I attended a space symposium in Colorado Springs, where I had opportunities of exchange views with numerous space experts by joining several events and bilateral meetings. It was such a fruitful week to figure out a current state of play regarding space technologies and policies. Now in Washington, D.C., I would like to take this opportunity to talk about the three subjects as opening thought, namely, first, a brief background history of Japan's space policy. Second, update of Japan-U.S. space cooperation. And third, the safe and sustainable use of outer space. First of all, let me talk about the brief background history of Japan's space policy. The enactment of the Basic Space Act in 2008 marked a turning point which allowed space development and utilization for security purpose. Furthermore, the revision of the JAXA law in 2012 enabled JAXA, Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, to contribute to the security field. In 2013, Japan formulated the first national security strategy, which included only a brief reference of space as out of global commons, together with maritime and cyberspace. However, after 9 years, the latest national security strategy, formulated in December 2022, includes extensive references to space, covering wide range of contexts such as security, civil, and industrial applications. In fact, recently, the Japanese government actively supports space field by the strategic headquarters for the space policy, where the chair is the Prime Minister, and the vice chairs are the Chief Cabinet Secretary and Minister of State for Space Policy. The basic plan on space policy is regularly formulated every 3 to 4 years at the strategic headquarters. The basic plan for space policy was revised in June 2023, following the 2022 National Security Strategy. The latest fifth basic plan on space policy outlines the basic direction of space policy for the next 10 years. And every year end, the implementation plan is revised to ensure the execution of measures supported by the national budget. Recently, in March 2024, the Space Technology Strategy was formulated by the Committee on Space Policy, and the Space Strategy Fund was created in JAXA by the government of Japan, pouring 1 trillion yen, approximately $6 billion for 10 years, which support space private companies, startups, and universities. Additionally, in June 2023, alongside the fifth basic plan on space policy, Japan formulated its first space security initiative, which includes a future space architecture and the three aspects, namely security from the space, security in the space, and the interaction between security and industry. Secondly, let me update the Japan-US space cooperation. In April last year, former Prime Minister Kishida and then President Biden held the Japan-US summit, resulting in a successful outcome and a joint statement. The statement mentioned the opportunities for Japanese two astronauts on landed on the moon in future Artemis missions as part of the exploration of new frontiers in space, including Japanese contribution of a pressurized rover produced by JAXA and Toyota. It also announced bilateral cooperation on a constellation for detecting and tracking hypersonic glide vehicles and other missiles in low Earth orbit. And it is also mentioned in the fact sheet that the Japan-US cross-government cooperation on the QGSS, quasi-Zenith satellite system program, including hosting US payload on QGSS satellites and the establishment of the QGSS ground station in the United States. In light of those developments, the ninth meeting of the U.S. Japan Comprehensive Dialogue on Space was held in in Washington in August 2024. I co-chaired the meeting with Ambassador Kumagai Naoki and the Minister of Home Affairs, while the U.S. side was co-chaired by Mr. Chirag Parikh, then Deputy Assistant, the President and the Executive Secretary, National Space Council, and Mr. Jason Israel, then Special Assistant to the President and the Senior Director for the Defense at the National Security Council. The comprehensive dialogue included not only government-to-government discussions, so-called Track 1.0, but also Track 1.5 dialogue involving industries around 40 companies from both countries. We had extensive discussions on a wide range of agenda, including security, civil, and commercial aspects. The comprehensive dialogue is a valuable opportunity for in-depth discussions between Japan and the United States, and it is essential to continue these discussions in the future. In the new U.S. administration on 7th February 2025, Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba and President Trump held a Japan-US summit in Washington, D.C. And the joint statement referred to the intention to continue a strong partnership in civil space and human exploration, including a mission to the International Space Station and the lunar surface exploration in future Artemis missions. It shows a continuous, robust space cooperation between Japan and the United States. Thirdly and finally, I would like to talk about the safe and sustainable use of outer space. In Japan, a ministerial task force on space traffic management was held at the end of March to review the effort of relevant ministries and companies. Specifically, we discussed the establishment of guidelines for preventing collisions with satellites, the progress in Space Situational Awareness (SAA) and Space Domain Awareness (SDA) by the Ministry of Defense and the Japan Air Self-Defense Forces. And we reviewed the progress of the commercial removal of the debris demonstration project called CRD-2 by JAXA and Astroscale. As space becomes more congested, rules and norms for orbital use, such as collision prevention, space situational awareness, and debris mitigation and limitations are essential in light of the security in space. In Japan, based on the Space Activities Act enacted in 2016, the on-orbit services guidelines were established in 2021. Japan Astroscale CRD2 conducted demonstration based on those guidelines, ensuring transparency and showcasing best practices to the world. Additionally, given the risks of destructive direct ascent anti-satellite missile test and the placement of weapons of mass destruction in space, it is crucial to actively contribute to international discussion on rule-making or norm-making, such as those in the United Nations corpus. Japan will continue to ensure the safe and sustainable use of outer space by advancing technological development and rule-making as two wheels of a cart, and will continue to communicate Japan's practical efforts to the international community. In conclusion, let me say a few words. Space is a frontier and robust field. There are many challenges and opportunities, and actions by all stakeholders are necessary. Action, action, and action. Now, I conclude my remark by wishing Japan-US Space Corporation develops further in coming years. Thank you for your attention.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'd also like to welcome our guests joining us in person and online. My name is Kari Bingen. I'm the director of the Aerospace Security Studies project here at CSIS. We are going to have a moderated discussion here for about 30 minutes, but I want to encourage our audience in person and online to ask questions. So if you're in person, scan the QR code and submit questions. If you're online, go to our event webpage and you can submit questions there. I also want to start out by thanking Sumitomo Corporation. Their support enables us to hold these kind of important discussions about the bilateral relationship. So Sumitomo, thank you for that support. It's been a privilege to get to know KAZEKI-san over several trips to Tokyo and his visits in DC, as we did some research here at CSIS for a study on U.S. Japan, the space security relationship. It's also a huge privilege to welcome Dr. Scott Pace, who is truly a space sensei. His biography is online, so I won't go over it, but I would just maybe show of hands here who's gone to Scott for advice or wisdom on space. Okay. We're gonna get, who hasn't? No. But just tremendous privilege to have you here as well. You know, there is, as Dr. Hamry said at the outset, uncertainty among our allies and partners about U.S. foreign policy right now. I think the independent think tanks have an important role to play in convening public and private sector experts to talk about how these partnerships move forward. Many of us were in Colorado Springs this week for the National Space Symposium. As KAZEKI-san mentioned, the Chief of Space Operations, General Saltzman, his keynote remarks centered largely on the value of our international space partnerships. So we'll pick up on that theme. We'll build on KAZEKI-san's excellent opening remarks with these two exceptional space leaders here today. So Scott, I'd like to start with you and give us some of your reflections. You've been deeply involved in leading on this relationship, probably for decades. Add some maybe color commentary or context to the arc of that relationship and what you're observing really now. What's different about now in the last couple of years?
Okay. That's a good question. I think one of the things is from a historical standpoint, okay, I'm an academic, so I'll pretend to be one. Japan developed pretty independently on its own and fairly narrowly in its areas. I mean, the initial launch vehicles it did were developed by academics who wanted really Japan to be autonomous in some of these areas. Japan did not participate in the joined, of course, the space station program, in part with the relationship between President Reagan and Prime Minister, I'm blanking. Nakasone.
Yeah.
There we go.
So,
Okay,
yeah.
senior moment. That was in part in the context of the Cold War period, as part of an anti-Soviet, coalition and so forth. And then Japan was a partner, of course, with the U.S. on space station with the introduction of Russia into the International Space Station program. And again, working with us in that reshaping geopolitical era. Throughout all that period, military use of space was just not on the table. I mean, Japan had made a decision in 1967, in deciding to sign the 1967 Outer Space Treaty that would interpret peaceful purposes as being non-military. That was really a diet level, kind of decision. And that had a number of implications for military use. The world then changed, and the threat environment became more serious. It was always sort of serious during the Cold War, but it started becoming more serious and more directed at Japan. Starting with things like the North Korea launching Taepodong, over Honshu, which sparked Japanese interest in electro-optical and radar satellite systems. But it was really the 2008 space policy change that KAZEKI-san mentioned that was really a seminal change to say, Japan has to be able to think about security uses of space. And so from that kind of watershed moment, a bunch of other things happened. But you should also pay attention to the things that had been built beforehand. Japan was the first country that we had an international statement on GPS with, the Clinton-Nobuchi statement in 1998, in part because we recognized Japan's commercial leadership, in GPS. So civil GPS has been growing, commercial GPS has been growing, then there's been the security side that has come to the fore, and then there's been a lot more rapid activities in recent years as the relationship has developed. Japan was one of the first countries we signed the 2013 SSA data sharing agreement with. Japan was the first we had comprehensive dialogue with. So there's been kind of this organic, growth over time. Hasn't all been easy, and I think some of those most difficult changes have been really on our side and on Japan's side. I think that right now, as Dr. Hamry mentioned, there's these questions about the alliances. I could go on that subject a bit more. But also on Japan's side, thinking about how to incorporate security and industry relations together in what has traditionally been a civil and scientific-driven program, but it needs to be more than that. So I think both of us, as a consequence of this cooperation, have been going through these internal rethinking. But we've been doing this for decades now together.
Well, and if I can pick up KAZEKI-san on what Scott just mentioned and hone in a bit more on Japan's space security policy. You mentioned the 2008 Basic Space Law, the Space Strategic Initiative that came out in 2022. I mean, we really have seen a sea change in your space security emphasis. Can you talk a bit about that and what's driving it?
Yeah, thank you, Kari. First of all, thank you for having me today, indeed. And actually, Scott articulated well the history of Japan, the sentiment of the space policy and security. And probably I would say two things. One is there was a certain history. Information gathering satellite started in the 1990s. So that was first breakthrough of Japan. And then recently, as I articulated in an opening remark, 2008, and after that, most recently, Space Security Initiative. So that's a current state. But the point is the change of the international security environment, indeed. Actually, two things. One is our national security strategy in 2022 said 5 powers are important. One is, I would say, technology power. Second, economic power. Third, information or intelligence power, both defense and diplomacy. So those 5 powers are articulated in the national security strategy in year 2022. And the space is interestingly covers all areas, all 5 powers indeed. So I talked about intelligence satellite, and now it's more like a security, of course, and a commercial too. So that's a trend because of the surrounding environment of the technology and the security. And actually, I was impressed by the General Whiting's comment regarding severe security circumstances in Colorado Springs that East Asia, China, of course, Russia, and there are outstanding risks in the space. Like direct ascent, missile testing is one thing. The other is, something like, untransparent or irresponsible behavior in the space. So his determination to tackle with those, risks and threats were very much impressive to me. So in the case of Japan, of course, in East Asia, we are facing severe security environment. That led to the change of the national security strategy indeed, after 9 years absence. So then the changes, I would say, technology and space technology, you see the commercial sectors coming. It's so rapid. The number of launches, number of satellites, last 3 years, 4 years, it's amazing. So those changes motivated us to further enhance our sort of space strategy as a government as a whole, including security on the center. It's always a first priority in a recent basic plan on space policy. So that is why we established the Space Security Initiative year 2023, followed by many relevant budgetary supports and the project. So that is what I'm seeing right now, why we are moving forward so quickly.
And it has been just fascinating to watch Japan's space ecosystem go from being, as Scott, you said, centered on JAXA and the civilian relationship with NASA to also now incorporating this military or security role as well. So it is a change, pretty significant change for Japan. Let me address, the big question out there is, where does space now play within these new administrations? Both Japan and the United States have new leadership at the top. By all accounts, President Trump and Prime Minister Ishiba had a constructive first meeting in February. Our next panel will discuss that in greater depth, but why should space cooperation be a priority for both the United States and Japan? So KAZEKI-san, I'll start with you. What is your sense of how space and space cooperation is viewed under the new Japanese leadership?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Under new Ishiba administration, I would say 3 positive developments. The first one is, first headquarters meeting last December. It's a headquarters meeting on space policy, and Ishiba, Prime Minister Ishiba is the chair of that meeting. That endorsed our basic plan on space policy implementation plan. So that is the first meeting after the launch of the new administration. So that assured the continuation of our space policy after, of course, Kishida and before. So that was encouraging, was first thing. Second, of course, as you mentioned, the summit meeting in February 7th. That was very much positive, including civil cooperation. And the third thing is budgetary support. Last year, under the special session of the Parliament, there was a discussion on the similar package. That is a supplementary budget discussion. And space finally was supported by Prime Minister to add another $2 billion for the Space Strategy Fund. So that was another positive sign. Even though there are many discussions regarding the use of the budget in Japan, space was safe and space was secured by the new Prime Minister. That means Space Strategic Fund supports all domains and in particular the activities by private sectors and the universities. So that is a very good sign for our people, indeed. So I think the short answer is that this is a huge continuation. I mean, and also 40 years, history, again, we are now safe.
Okay, Scott, I'm going to ask you the same question, and I'm going to ask you to channel your former role as the Executive Secretary of the National Space Council in the first Trump administration.
Well, I think the first thing you'd say is, and I spoke at the National Institute for Defense Studies, in Tokyo in December, and got asked this question, and I'll say the same thing. It would be a mistake to assume that Trump 2.0 is the same as Trump 1.0. Okay, and I think that's true in space as well. If I look at these space issues, and this is maybe rather egotistical to say, I don't think we left a lot of work to be done on space policy, and so I would hope there'd be really just a lot of continuity on the space policy. There are certainly some things in space transportation policy you probably would clean up here and there. But I think the second Trump administration, the emphasis on space, I think will be, and I don't speak for the administration, put that very clearly, will be very much on execution. It's really programmatics. NASA has a lot of big problems on its plate. Space Force has a lot of big problems. The commercial industry is facing a lot of challenges. So it's not high-level policy concepts or priorities that I think are really needed. In the case of Japan, for example, I think like the space initiatives, security initiative Japan has, I think are great. I mean, I read them and I go, this makes a ton of sense, very logical, it flows. Where both Japan and the U.S., I think, then run into difficulties is then at that execution point. In the Japan documents is, okay, great, I understand all those objectives. How do those translate into requirements or demand signals that industry can respond to? And how do they respond? In what form do they respond? And writing those requirements and translating policy into programs and technical work is really hard. This is not an easy task. On the U.S. side, we have, I think, just a ton of work to do in program management, execution, really even just system engineering, the challenges. Artemis, for example, is a gigantic system engineering challenge, in part because of the policy to have commercial and international partners, which I think is wonderful, but now you're having lots of different people coming together, and you have to integrate all that. And as anybody knows, the integration of ground systems is one of the things where programs will go bad. So I think greater attention down and in at the agency level is probably going to be the hallmark of the second Trump administration's space agency. I did want to say one thing, though, relative to Dr. Hamre's point about alliances. It's absolutely true that the U.S. historically, of course, values allies, say, more than China does. I mean, just put that out there. We think alliances are important. We, of course, argue about what the allies should do and who should go first and what should happen. But in general, I think we do have interest in, very much our self-interest in alliances. I think what a lot of the foreign policy community and sometimes I think think tanks miss is that those policies can only be successful if they're in alignment with where the public interest is, where the public it goes. A friend from Trump 1, Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger, wrote a great book on boiling moat and defense of Taiwan, which I recommend to people. But he speaks fluent Chinese, and he did a video one time talking to China's own democratic aspirations, which has a history in it. And he said part of the tensions in the U.S. is not between left and right, but between top and bottom. That is, the feeling that the global economy and changes and things that happened over decades did not benefit middle class or the middle of the country. So it's absolutely true. The U.S. has benefited from globalization. But who? Where? How are those benefits distributed? What happened to working class people? What are educational opportunities? How have we dealt with social problems that have come up? And so if people feel that their political leadership is disconnected from their interests, it's not surprising that you'll hear this criticism. So I believe it's absolutely correct, as Dr. Henry points out, that allies are important to us. But it's also important for those people in Washington to think about, well, what do people elsewhere in the country think? Because we can't have a stable foreign policy or a stable engagement unless the American people in general are also going to be supportive of that. And I don't think that case has really been well made in recent years.
Well, I want to come back to that. Let me shift gears a bit, and I want to unpack some different dimensions of our bilateral space relationship. First, I want to start with the military dimension, and Scott, you mentioned a need to just more solidify requirements and a demand signal. So talk about our progress in our military space relationship and maybe some of the specific areas of need or focus going forward, and perhaps let's contrast the decades-long civil space relationship between JAXA and NASA, and now this budding military one, which is the military operational needs are very different than what the scientific community needs. Yeah, so maybe.
Well, I think one of the first ones is, in order to write coherent requirements, there has to be a base of experience to work from. In things like maritime domain awareness, we did some of the first tabletop exercises, command post exercises, just to build a common basis of understanding. Okay, what's happened, we've gone past that. Now it's how do we build a common basis of experience when we operate together? So I would place a big emphasis on exercises, incorporating space as a routine part of military exercise between the U.S. and Japan, and also as importantly within the Japanese self-defense forces themselves. I mean, most people, I think in the U.S. don't realize that in many ways the Japanese armed forces are a pre-Goldwater-Nichols military, joint and combined arms operations, because given the policy of just simply the defense of Japan, has not developed in the same way, say, that joint operations have been developed in Korea. And so space is inherently a very joint thing. Electronic warfare, cyberspace are very much these kind of joint and combined arms kind of technique. And I think space can be used to drive greater interoperability, greater jointness in the Japanese forces. And I think the policy recognizes that. And so again, it's the execution part of how do we start gaining experiences with using space. For those of you who speak, DoD terms, a bunch more, Army FA-40s need to be deployed, in there to work with, their Japanese counterparts. And then from that, you can start writing, I think more coherent, sustainable requirements that industry can be able to build with. You don't have to do one or the other or one first, but gaining experiences, working together, driving out real requirements that then industry can be able to respond to with either commercial or specialized offerings, I think is the next step.
Well, and we've started building the structures for that with Japan's Space Operations Group that stood up, with that U.S. Space Force Field Command that's now headquartered in Japan. So the pieces are there. It's now putting the meat in there of those training, those exercises, et cetera.
Yep.
Yeah, that is actually what I would like to say, that the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force started SSA exercise, as you said, Space Operations Group, March 2023. And it grew up now, Space Operations Wing, and it will amount to, I would say, 670 people working on the SSA only.
That's a lot.
So you said importance of the requirements for the industries regarding defense equipment on the space. Well, we start with, of course, information sharing, and by having such a robust institution, and also December 2023, we decided to join a CSPO, Combined Space Operation Initiative, which is composed of 10 countries, Five Eyes, and France, Germany, Italy, Norway, and Japan. So now we are in the member of 10, sharing circle. So that is an encouraging sign for us to start such kind of a teamwork or combined work with other ally and like-minded countries.
Great. Building off of this, when we talk about space situational awareness, I've just been so impressed by how far the commercial sector, and I'll say commercial SSA services, have come and their ability to contribute. So in the area of technology and industry cooperation, where should we focus our respective industrial bases so that we're not duplicating, but playing off or building complementary strengths? We've seen like co-production of missiles with the Aegis Missile Defense Program. How should we think about some of those different models in the space sector? How should we think about these commercial space companies and capabilities coming online? How should we think about private capital going into our respective ecosystems?
Yeah.
Well, I would say there are two parts. There's a space part, and then there's a larger security relationship part. The space part is, you need to have, I think, further clarification on the priorities for these very different proliferated LEO constellations. There's a need for missile warning, which has been around for a long time, hypersonic target detection, and then really, and a larger picture, the need for tactical ISR in space. I mean, everybody understands what the missile environment is, so terrestrial ISR are very vulnerable. And so those are like three very big different types of proliferated LEO systems, and we ourselves are struggling with priorities, for these different systems. So within the space world, I think thinking about priorities and phasings of those large mega constellations. But I think we should also be careful not to get stuck in the space area and dolly back and look at the larger strategic relationship. One thing the administration is emphasizing is shipbuilding. And it's no secret that U.S. shipbuilding is terrible. And it was a problem we talked about in the first Trump administration. And so South Korea and Japan, as well as China, are big, giant, shipbuilders. And so from looking at the defense industrial base relationship of all the like-minded countries, where can we look at balancing some of these strengths? Maybe the U.S. can lead in providing, space capabilities and technology and partnering with countries, but we would look for other contributions like shipbuilding, munitions productions, anti-ship missiles, anti-air missiles. As a really basic example, we don't produce enough 155 millimeter artillery shells for Ukraine, and we depend on Poland and Finland and others. So we look at the entire industrial base, and I think when you do that, you can start thinking about opportunities in streamlining or removal of export controls between like-minded countries, easier co-production agreements. But it's not just through the narrow lens of space, but it's looking at the larger defense industrial base, particularly across the Pacific. And so where can we contribute, and where are there strengths in our allies that we should take advantage of?
That's a really great point.
Yeah, to me, of course, in the space field, large constellation is in a low Earth orbit is a quite important project. In Japan, we are progressing a lot, and United States, of course, promoting PWSA, proliferated warfighting space architecture, where Japan may have a chance to join to cooperate with U.S. initiative. So that paves the way for the co-production or cooperation in a specific area. Others, of course, we are now developing optical radar communication system. So that is another avenue to cooperate with the United States. It's an area of the communication. So detecting, tracking, it's very important, and communication is another thing. And regarding missile defense, well, we had a very good achievement, GPI, Wide-Phased Interceptor, where co-production project between U.S. company and the Japanese company have already been in progress. So I think it's such accumulation of use cases are quite important between the United States and Japan. That gives me an opportunity for us to have a comprehensive dialogue, I say, to have a track 1.5 or 2.0 dialogue between industries. So we may give a certain trigger for the discussion regarding a particular use case or particular interest of both industries.
Well, it's interesting. I've been having some space situational awareness conversations with folks in both countries, and I think in some areas there's an opportunity for Japan, I'll say, to even leapfrog where the United States is, because we are so beholden to some of these decades-old systems and ways about doing business. And as you build up some of these security capabilities, you really can greenfield or clean sheet your approach to these areas. Let me shift to international and diplomatic cooperation. I saw some of our friends in the audience from Secure World Foundation who's done a lot of great work there as well. Japan has been a strong partner with the United States in international space-related forums, including co-sponsoring a resolution in the UN on Russia's nuclear anti-satellite weapons development. So, KAZEKI-san, can you talk through Japan's diplomatic efforts related to space security? And you mentioned sustainability in your remarks.
Okay. We have a regular sort of symposium or forum for advancing this safe and sustainable use of outer space concept, like a National Space Policy Secretariat Symposium every February. And actually, we had a good conversation, Scott and myself, and others had a very good discussion last 2 years. How can we, achieve the safe and sustainable use of outer space? Our approach is this. I mean, we develop high standard technology like a JAXA ASO scale project to do actual debris removal. And we also develop our own regulations. Uniquely, Cabinet Office is a regulator. So we have a Space Activities Act, and we formulated the guidelines 2021. So JAXA also used these guidelines to show that their projects are fully transparent. Their orbit, their plan are all transparent. And you can see at the homepage of the cabinet and the private sector. So that we believe that show the best practice for the world, because those activities are transparent, no doubt, sometimes, PRO, proximity and rendezvous operations could, be untransparent and irresponsible or ambiguous and so on. So once we show the best practices, adversaries cannot hide. So that is what we are doing right now. So we are selling this idea to the United Nations too. And also last summer, as you said, we had a joint sort of summit in Asia with the World Security Foundation. So that was very much successful in Asia, how we are developing those ideas. So we'll continue to do so under the forum or even Corpus and other places. But of course, it should be combined with robust cooperation between the U.S. and Japan regarding this, because we share the same value on civil and security both, and also a very strong cooperation on the commercial sector.
Well, Scott, you've led several of those delegations from a U.S. side. Where should we be forging ahead in this area?
Well, I think in the spirit of focusing on execution, as we've had these various, kind of track 1.5, track 2 kinds of engagements, I'd actually hope to see more intersessional work. I mean, it's one thing for us to come together at an annual, level and take a stock taking and an understanding of each other, which is because we've done this a lot. We have a pretty good understanding about who our counterparts are and what the issues are and so forth. And that's the great first step. But then the next question is, okay, what have you done? What have you accomplished since the last one? So, for example, hearing more from industry about, where their problems are, and then taking those on, as actions to go be worked. I would point out that at the end of the Biden administration, there were some export control reforms. It came out that Sean Wilson basically carried across the finish line. But it started from work, policy direction that we started in Trump 1 that was then carried through the Biden administration, and it's not over yet. There is still more to do. So these things are a relay game long term, but in order to keep an eye on it, I think that the diplomatic sessions we have, one should have more industry and civil society involvement. This is a multi-stakeholder environment, not just a multilateral environment. And there should be more attention on intersessional work, so that we report on results rather than just simply, status snapshots.
Well, so picking up on that then, what are the challenges and barriers to allowing us to do that, or to some of these cooperation opportunities that we've discussed in general? Give us a realist perspective on what's doable.
Interagency clearance.
It's the interagency.
Interagency.
Okay, explain that to us a bit more.
It's a bit sensitive one for the 18 institutions in the United States regarding security clearance. But we are developing our own security clearance system. Actually, last year we passed a law, Economic Security Information Use and Protection Act, so it's now near to be implemented actually. So that is an encouraging sign to enhance the cooperation between the United States and Japan. So actually, I made a presentation last August regarding this new act at the Competency Dialogue Track 1.5, together with the discussion on export controls. So that is another important topic, as you said. If we have a co-production or supply chain sort of creation, we need a sort of a relaxation of the U.S. export controls. But I, at the same time, as a former DG for export control of Japan, I know the difficulty of this. So therefore, certain, very, I would say, solo discussions are necessary between the two sort of authorities and or two governments regarding what kind of things the U.S. Company needs to export a certain sensitive product to Japan, vice versa. So that would be a good, avenue for further cooperation between us.
And Scott, you've forgotten more about this topic than I talk about that because you were working on that when you were in before.
Well, I think the security clearance thing, I think, really is a major milestone. I think people don't quite appreciate how strong privacy laws are in Japan. Very, very serious. I remember speaking to a Diet member about the need to have this legislation for security clearance so we could kind of work with it a little bit more seamlessly, less difficulty in the clearances, because there really isn't a political problem, but there's a process, bureaucratic problem. The comment was, well, you know, we fill out non-disclosure forms all the time. I go, oh no, let me show you SF-86. Let me bring this up on my phone, 136 pages of goodness, you know, to fill that. Please don't do that. There was a very deliberative process that Japan went through, come up with the legislation, have advice, implement it, and we need to, I think, take advantage of it. I think another area that did not make, and I know even though KAZEKI-san worked really hard on it, but the Technology Safeguards Agreement, you know, so that we could, for easier launching of commercial payloads out of Japan, landing of aircraft, spacecraft in Japan. So there's a number of the TSA issues. Were really more some issues in the diet we had to work through, so even though we wanted to do it. So there's always interagency or legislative things you have to get through. I think that probably the biggest barrier, though, still is probably on the cyber side, being able to, you know, maybe find a way to have a secure cloud environment where we can all kind of be and share at whatever our levels are, but making that more routine in the same way it is. So just as we want to be able to interact with Japanese space folks in the same way we interact with, say, French or Italian or German NATO activities, just make that as kind of as seamless as possible. And it's not just a nice to do, it's really vital, because if you look at the Japanese material capabilities, you know, the amount of kit they have in terms of launch vehicles, satellites, so forth, pretty much bigger than any of the Five Eyes other than the United States. Okay, they're in a tough region. They have lots of capabilities. We have to be doing better at interchange with you and removing some of these barriers and things like personnel and cyber and export controls and so forth. Plenty of work to do.
And just on the export control policies, and hopefully, Sean, your panel will get into this a little bit more, but I mean, it really at this point is, you had the Trump administration tackle it, the Biden administration tackle it, but we still need the execution. And I look at one of our closest allies in the world, so many opportunities on space, by revisiting some of those constraints, you are opening up, I'll say, U.S. companies to supporting Japan's security needs, but you're also improving the health of our industrial base and our companies, who you don't want solely reliant on the U.S. government. You want them to also diversify their revenue sources as well. So it really is a two-for benefit there. Let me ask a question from the audience here. This is Yanni Nikas, who's at Group W and a former Aerospace Security Program intern. He asks, what is special about the U.S. Japan relationship that makes cooperating on space issues so important?
Yeah, I think, of course, it includes both civil and security, and as well as finally commercial. I mean, we had a long trust and confidence between JAXA and NASA. That's good news. International Space Station as well. Exploration, science, the huge history. Yeah, and also security, we started a lot. So that's all areas. As I said at the beginning, it's a 5 powers, all relevant. So that's gave us a very good opportunity to strengthen U.S. Japan cooperation to expand all the areas as a leader of the policy development of both countries. So that's my sense. And recently, Artemis is a good avenue to do so. Yeah, indeed.
And then Scott, if I can have you build on that, and to your earlier comments, how do we ensure that political and public support for deepening this relationship?
Well, I think that the way you do that is for space policy to be sustainable, and that word means all kinds of things to different people, whether it's economic or political or whatever. But I think space takes a long time. It is hard. And in order to be sustainable and have consistent policy, you need to make sure that it's aligned with enduring national interests. It cannot be just because space people think something is cool. It has to be because there are larger, very hard-eyed national interests at stake. And I think in the case of Japan and the United States, we very much have very strong overlapping interests with each other, as well as an affection and a friendship that's come from working together for decades and decades and doing hard things. And I think that there, as people have heard me say forever. It's not just astronauts and robots we send into space, it's our values. And so the fact that Japan is a partner has been, an incredibly steady partner. Lord knows the space station changed lots and lots of times. Kibo did not. It remained there, even as everything else changed around it. And that kind of trust and commitment that Japan makes.
Yeah, that's one thing. Value of the U.S.-Japan relationship is the possibility of the expansion to the region. For example, in the Asian region or in the world, how can we sell our concept like a free and open Indo-Pacific, for example, and safe and sustainable use of outer space? For example, Artemis Accord now it's composed of 54 members. It's amazing. I really appreciate the effort by the State Department regarding this. And trying to outreach the other side of the team, of course. So that is a really good sign. And also our Quad meeting, Japan, United States, India, and Australia, we had a very robust cooperation on the security, and the space working group is ongoing, like SSA. And in fact, I had last week, on 1st of April, had a meeting. It's a co-chaired, formal dialogue between India and Japan, third version. We had a very good discussion, but it's in line with the U.S.-Japan cooperation, like our LUPEX project between India and Japan. It's in line with the Artemis program to explore the lunar surface together with India by providing our H3 rockets and our rover. And India provides their lander to the moon. So that will be launched fiscal year 2026. So that kind of things is sort of a U.S.-Japan, and now it's India Quad, and even global. And we have a security arrangement with Japan, US, Korea. That is a director level discussion, but still it's a good basis for the security, or I would say arguably deterrence for the Asia-Pacific region. So that is the value of the US-Japan, very robust relationship on the security side.
And we'll be able to continue to do these things with or without a National Space Council, Scott?
I've been in a situation with one, without one. There's a lot of different ways you can do something. The first Space Council I worked with, I was the commerce rep to the Space Council in Bush 41, and Dan Quayle was vice president. And it was actually kind of fortuitous to have a council at that time, because it was right at the end of the Cold War, and that a lot of issues came up that required really coordination across the whole of government. It was nice having that mechanism. Then there was a lot of time where we didn't have one. There's been variations that go up in it, but you need a process to resolve these issues. The White House's job is to press its agenda down, adjudicate issues that come up. But ultimately, a Space Council is a tool to be used. It's not, sometimes space people think, oh, if we were important, we would have a council. How come people don't love us more? And that's really the wrong question. You have to say, what's the task in front of you? I think a Space Council would be helpful for policy issues, but it's not quite as, I think, obvious and necessary as it was in Trump 1. I think in Trump 2, there are policy issues, and there needs to be a mechanism, but there also needs to be a way for the agencies to kind of get on with managing and executing what they have in front of us. If I wanted to add something to Kazeki-san's point about the partnerships, particularly the ones with India, I think is terrific. When I would be in Japan and I would talk about Artemis, I would say this is not just a science project. Yeah. This is not a military program, but it is a security program.
That's right.
And it's a security program as part of the free and open Indo-Pacific, whatever, because space is a region that we don't own. We can't put a fence around it. We can't control it in the same way we can control other domains. So one of the ways that we protect our interests and the interests of our allies and common values is we get other people who want to be part of it.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, and and by wanting to be part of it, particularly with meaningful roles, not just token, but meaningful roles in shaping that environment, we protect our own interests. And so I heard the other day the Secretary of Defense used one of my favorite phrases from the first Trump administration, from H.R. McMaster. America first doesn't mean America alone. Okay, it means us, with like-minded friends. Now, we can argue about burden sharing and who does what and priorities and all that kind of thing, but especially for space, we can't be alone. We have to have other commercial international partners with us to shape this environment in our own self-interest and common values.
Well, and Japan has just long been a civil space
Yeah.
and technological leader. We're seeing that also now expand into the security sector. You know, I think I'm going to end here because we're at time, but I'll just say, in hearing the both of you talk, you know, it really does highlight just how deepening cooperation across the board in space it is in both of our national security, economic, you know, overall national interests, highlighting complementary strengths and looking outside of just space-to-space cooperation, but expanding the aperture, and just the importance of not just waiting for those comprehensive dialogues, but continuing the momentum and the execution in between those as well. I want to thank you both for your tremendous leadership over the decades in this area. I mean, we would not be where we are today without you, KAZEKI-san and Dr. Pace, all that you've done for the relationship. So I want to thank them. I'll just remind everybody, we're going to take a quick break to get the next panel up. We're privileged to welcome the Honorable Melissa Dalton, CSIS non-resident in the Aerospace Security Program, and also former Undersecretary of the Air Force. So privileged to have her lead our next discussion. And then for those in person here today, stick around through the end. We do have a fantastic networking reception just out in the foyer here. So again, if you'll join me in thanking these gentlemen, and we'll shift gears here.
started with our first panel discussion. I'm Melissa Dalton. I'm delighted to return to CSIS as a senior advisor in the Aerospace Security Project, led by Kari Bingen, who led the prior discussion. I've served for 4 years in the Biden administration, had the honor of serving as the Undersecretary of the Air Force, where I worked closely on space issues, but also more broadly in prior years had an opportunity to work on defense policy. So I'm really excited to be teeing up today's conversation. We have a distinguished panel of experts, including Nick Cheney, the Vice President of Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department and Senior Fellow of the Japan Chair here at CSIS. We have Dr. Sadia Pekkanen, who is the Job and Gertrude Tamaki Endowed Professor of International Studies and the Adjunct Professor of Political Science and the Adjunct Professor of Law at the University of Washington. And we have Greg Rubenstein, who is the Adjunct Fellow here with the Japan Chair at CSIS. We're going to frame this discussion to focus on the U.S. Japan security relationship, pulling from some of the threads from the prior conversations, but also broadening the aperture beyond space, because it's important to situate why space is important in the evolution of Japan's security and defense strategy and the overall context of the bilateral security relationship. As with the prior discussion, the audience can scan the QR code if you have any questions. We will preserve some time for that. If you're joining us online, you can log your questions via the website and invite you to do so. To kick things off, I've asked each of our panelists a few minutes of framing remarks to kind of walk us through the journey and different lenses to apply to the U.S.-Japan security relationship. So we'll start with Nick.
Great, thank you. Pleasure to be here and an honor to be on such a distinguished panel. I thought I would start just by building on the comments from the earlier discussion about the evolution of Japan's defense strategy and the alliance relationship with the United States. I think generally speaking, it's a story of incremental defense policy reforms in response to changes around Japan's security environment. And if I think about the history of the U.S.-Japan alliance, I could tell you or share episodes with you where Japan was making reforms, enhancing defense capabilities with the urging of the United States. But I don't think we're in that era anymore. I think the most prominent example is what you heard about earlier, Japan's 3 strategic documents unveiled in 2022, a second national security strategy, an attendant national defense strategy, and very pertinent to this discussion, a 5-year defense procurement plan in which space features very prominently. The reason I think that's so significant is because that strategy was not in response to the urging of the United States or other allies or partners in the region. It was Japan as a frontline state analyzing the rapidly deteriorating security environment around it, realizing that it had to rapidly accelerate its defense capabilities. And that's a key variable that I think we should keep in mind in the context of this discussion is time. We don't have time, and things need to happen quickly, and we need to think strategically about how to enhance alliance cooperation in that context. The national security strategy, put very simply, it has 3 pillars. Japan strengthening its own defense capabilities, strengthening the alliance with the United States, and partnering with other like-minded countries in Asia. And space features in all of those, so it's really quite remarkable. We've already heard about how the defense strategy featured an emphasis on acquiring new defense capabilities, space of course, but also counterstrike and various other capabilities, including advanced technologies, as KAZEKI-san mentioned earlier. So very prominent emphasis on advanced capabilities acquired in a short period of time. But there are also operational aspects to Japan's strategy, which I think are significant in the context of this discussion. One is an initiative just unveiled, where Japan, to facilitate coordination inside the government and with the different arms of the self-defense forces, standing up a joint operations command getting back to my point about time. When you're on the front lines of these security threats in Asia, you have to make decisions quickly. And so Japan operationally is now in a place to facilitate rapid coordination internally. By extension, Defense Secretary Hegseth, who was in Japan recently, reaffirmed a U.S. commitment to stand up a counterpart to that Joint Operations Command in Japan to facilitate alliance coordination. And that process of coordination strengthens interoperability between our two militaries, which is a key element of deterrence, of course, and space also plays a role of that. So you have their own defense capabilities, coordination and tightening of the alliance with the United States. Third piece, and I'll end with this, is collaboration with like-minded partners. Australia, Philippines, South Korea figure very prominently in Japan's strategic documents. But I'll end with South Korea, especially in the context of the ballistic missile threat from North Korea, where in recent years we've seen a great deal of progress trilaterally in sharing real-time data to manage the North Korean missile threat, and also create a more routine exercising regimen across domains to ensure that the U.S. Japan South Korea alliance network is sending those deterrence signals, and space is also a key area in that context. So really, really interesting developments. I think, as you heard earlier, Japan and the U.S., together with other partners, are very much strategically aligned. Lots of challenges to address and overcome, but it's a really exciting time to be thinking about these issues.
Great. Thanks so much, Nick, for helping to set the strategic context. I'd like to turn to Sadia next in terms of how you see the security evolution.
Well, thank you very much, Melissa, for shepherding this conversation, and thank you, Kari, and the Aerospace program for having us here. I want to preface my comments by saying that we are in a new world order. And this is in America, first world order in which our established ways of thinking really have to contend with very fresh political visions in the United States in particular. It's with that in mind that I would like to bring in Japan and the U.S. Japan alliance into the conversation and leave you with some thoughts about where it might be headed in the future. But just echoing a little bit about what you heard in the first panel, Japan is, of course, a very prominent and preeminent space power. It has full spectrum capabilities across rockets, satellites, spacecraft, all kinds of new technologies, and keeps abreast of the latest technologies as well, particularly those that intersect with emerging and disruptive technologies. And I think what is also extremely important about Japan is that across Asia, for example, and Melissa, you asked me what it might mean in the context of Asia, but across Asia for the past 3 decades or so, Japan has couched this very potent, pretty lethal, dual-use technology in a formidable, long-duration space diplomacy that has reassured its neighbors about how the same technology can also be used for their socioeconomic development. But because the United States looms large in Japan's space portfolio for a number of reasons, and because of the presence of the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance, I want to tailor my remarks a little bit more to the U.S.-Japan portion of the story. And really echoing what you heard in the first panel, as well as the remarks earlier, it is absolutely true that Japan has changed its national security postures and policies. And space has also mirrored that evolution over time. And today, I think that there can be no dispute that Japan is much more forceful, much more forthright about its space defense postures going forward. And we see this in a number of ways. For example, I think this was again also mentioned, the U.S. Space Force Component Field Command was activated in December of last year. And Japan itself is consolidating its space operation group that is going to be also intersecting with things like electromagnetic warfare as well as cyberspace warfare going forward. So let me just make 2 big points with respect to what this means. This country that's extraordinarily capable and continues to be extraordinarily capable on the space front, what does it mean in an America First World Order to speak about the cooperation between them? First, on the industrial base itself, and here's how I would put things with respect to Japan. For Japan, space security has long been economic security as well. Japan has a long history of indigenizing and bringing in technologies that have economic security linkages, and this space is no exception to that particular trajectory in its history. What is different and what is interesting is the return of this very muscular industrial policy in the case of the United States, and also a sort of its own developmental ethos in the United States that sort of is putting America first. So as you heard in the first panel, I think that the task for industry-to-industry collaboration as well as industry-to-government collaboration in the defense sphere is going to rise with force in both countries. And how do we sit down and figure out what might work in that context is something that I think we need to pay attention to, not just the conceptualization of it, but all the way to execution for something like space domain awareness, which I think deserves a special attention in the realities that we have today. The second big point I just want to leave you with has to do with alliances per se. This is one of the world's, I would say, very stable, very durable, and I hope will continue to be an alliance that moves forward. So some of the remarks that I'm making is with the thought of how best can we keep that momentum going in, as I said, an America First world order. There are two narratives, of course, about the U.S. Japan alliance per se. One narrative is that this is the very preeminent, the most prominent, the cornerstone of U.S. Leadership and stability and order in the Asian region. The other narrative, gaining ground in an America First world order, is that there are certain imbalances in this relationship. And I think that those imbalances deserve attention, particularly under a Trump 2.0 administration. One imbalance, I think, is, of course, in the text of the treaty itself. I think I don't need to probably tell this audience, but it's very clear that that can certainly draws the eye in an America First world order, so to speak, which is that the Americans have to come to the defense of territories under the administration of Japan, but the reverse is not necessarily true. Now, this alliance has also been officially extended to space, but speaking primarily from a space law and policy perspective, that the very idea that this can be extended to space makes zero sense in the context of space law and policy. So there is a diplomatic area in which I think the two countries can focus on and think about the building blocks for how to make that more clear and more in line with the realities, not just technical, but also law and policy. And the other imbalance that I want to leave you with is, of course, has to do with the threat alignments. Of course, it is absolutely true that Japan shares the threat perceptions of the US in the space domain. It's orbital debris intertwined with weaponization. It's the intersection of space with emerging and disruptive technologies like cyber and AI, for example. And there is, of course, the looming threat of nuclear politics also in space. But when you look at the numbers, what you realize instantly is that threats are not necessarily proportionate across the US and Japan. Of the 11,800 or so operational satellites, I think 67%, 70% belong to the United States, and most of those are actually commercial and civilian in nature. Japan has only about 2% of the total operational satellites. So the risks are not exactly the same, and so that makes a difference for what that means. Now, where I think Japan can come in, and this is where the Trump-Ishiba statement that was made earlier this year becomes extremely important, has to do with, I'm forgetting the exact phrase, but it is further enhancing US extended deterrence. Because as everybody knows, the nuclear command, control, and communications structures for extended deterrence run in and through space. So Japan certainly has an incentive to try and think about the clarity that it can bring to the table, or the operational clarity, the legal and policy clarity that both sides need to sit down and think about as we move forward from here. So thank you. I will leave you with those remarks.
Great. Thanks so much, Sadia. And just to underscore that last point, given the breathtaking nuclear modernization that China has been undertaking, that emphasis on extended deterrence and how we can further our cooperation is as vital as ever. Really helpful framing, and to connect to Greg's remarks, Greg has been doing some terrific work on industrial cooperation with Japan and some of the acquisition trends that I know Sadia briefly hit on. But Greg, if you'd like to take us a step deeper on that.
Okay, thank you. Anybody who's watched trends in U.S. Japan defense cooperation in the acquisition industrial area know that for decades, the two countries have been locked in a very static pattern of supplier-customer relations, largely one-way transfers through sales, through licenses, coupled with some indigenous development programs in Japan. Occasional two-way exchanges on basic defense research, but nothing that really translated into deployable programs. The results generally met the interests of stakeholders on both sides. May have been inefficient, may have been unnecessarily costly, but there was little incentive to change the pattern for many years. In the last several years, these trends have started to shift, as has been discussed. In the U.S., there has been, I think, a realization that challenges in the Indo-Pacific region require a response, operationally as well as in capabilities development, that must extend beyond supplier-customer to real resource-sharing partnerships. In the case of Japan, that desire for more effective defense acquisition and stronger industrial base simply cannot be met by reliance on isolated indigenous programs and imports from the U.S., that there has to be greater engagement of the international community. You have seen this recently in Japan's undertaking a trilateral partnership with the UK and Italy in development of a future combat fighter aircraft, and in the establishment last year of the somewhat elegantly named DICAS, Defense Industrial Cooperation and Acquisition Sustainment Initiative.
Good thing there's an acronym.
Yes.
Something of that. And so you have this convergence now of in defense cooperation towards more partnerships, and at the same time evolution of a very cooperative relationship in commercial space towards more security defense programs. These two have come together now in ways that I think you can see some common themes. First of all, in the increased use of commercial technologies, their application into defense programs, and second, into an expansion of partnerships and contributors from traditional prime contractor and supplier networks to more non-traditional, new technology commercial companies. I think these will be critical trends for the future. I think I'll stop there. Just
Terrific,
Yes.
and we can pick up on some of those threads in the discussion here. So to kind of take us back to where the United States and Japan intersect on their security relationship, we really need to start thinking about the threat. And both Nick and Sadia hit on this in part. And this is a little bit of an unfair question because we're only learning about how the second Trump administration is defining its defense and national security strategies, but we have some early indicators. But maybe to start with Nick, do the United States and Japan share a common threat assessment of the importance in space in the context of their national security and defense strategies?
I think my short answer to that question is yes. As we heard a little bit earlier, this was a prominent issue area during the first Trump administration. And even if you just fast forward to the last few weeks and read what Secretary Hegseth said during his recent visit to Japan, if you assume that that is the framework for a Trump 2.0 defense strategy, it's all about forward presence in Asia. It's about surging resources to Asia. It's about jointness and interoperability with allies like Japan. And so to me, at least on paper, it looks like we're going to see some continuity, despite broader concerns about where U.S. foreign policy under the second Trump administration might be heading. I do share Sadia's observations about what the uncertainties associated with America First and what that means. But I would just conclude by saying that Japan is one of the few allies, and there's evidence of this during the first Trump administration, that has found a way to manage this dynamic, which is not to respond to every comment or declaration out of Washington about Japan's capabilities, its commitments to defense, or its value as an ally, but instead to demonstrate it by constantly reiterating its progress and its strategies and its instinct to work with the U.S. and be a reliable ally. And Prime Minister Ishiba did a very good job of signaling that when he came to Washington in February. And I think that's the trick for Japan. Anytime, whether it's space or any other issue, there's a sense that priorities might be diverging, to come and reiterate that message, because I think it is quite compelling. And Japan can confidently come to Washington and review the very proud history of cooperation on space and other elements of defense strategy and pick up from there. So some uncertainty, but fundamentally I'm pretty confident that we're going to see continuity in this area.
Great. Sadia?
So I see, of course, there's always uncertainty. I agree with Nick, but in some ways, the U.S. is now extremely clear about its own national interests. America comes first, and whatever we are doing with our allies should comport with some interest in the United States. So I think that is very clear to not just Japan, but to all our allies around the world. And I also agree that with respect to space, I can say this definitively, both countries see, at least the establishment sees, the same kinds of threats, right? So we are dealing with orbital debris, we're dealing with weaponization, and as I said, we're now also potentially dealing with nuclearization of space. So the big, I think, commonality that might draw them together is the issue of what Trump and Ishiba said in their statement, which is how do we further enhance nuclear deterrence? Since that NC3 piece runs in and through space, I think it behooves the two countries to sit down and think about the role that not just the corporations, but the two foreign and defense policy establishments can sit down and work out and hammer out what that precisely means in the context of that relationship going forward.
Great, thank you. And so maybe to extend that conversation a bit further and apply specific country threat lenses. So I think perhaps a little bit more alignment on China, reference the SecDef's trip. What about North Korea? Are there more similarities in terms of threat perceptions vis-a-vis space, but even just more broadly in terms of what North Korea is doing in the region? How is the United States thinking about North Korea going forward in a second Trump administration?
Well, how can I respond? I think it's complicated because I think we can't divorce space from what is going on around geopolitically around us, and particularly with what is happening in Ukraine. So as you may have heard, there are, of course, North Korean boots on the ground, but if reports are to be believed, Chinese boots are also on the ground. And that, I think, complicates given President Trump's history with both North Korea and the way that he tried to engage them, as well as overtures that he's making to China, even as he's engaged in a trade war, I think it's a little bit complicated in terms of definitively saying that this is a threat or this is not a threat. But I think for everybody, I think anybody who is sort of focused on space security, the nuclear piece is, I think, the most important and distinct piece that needs to be stabilized across all partners. Now, this is something I think Japan can certainly get behind. I think this is something that NATO can get behind. And I think this is also important for the United States leadership on nuclear politics per se. So I would say that perhaps that's a threat that we can all agree that might be of interest in trying to stabilize in the context of space security.
Great. Yeah, anything you want to add, Nick?
I would just say briefly from my vantage point, I think concern for Japan based on the experience during the first Trump administration is whether there will be a focus not just on the long-range missile threat, but the short-range missile threat, which Japan feels more intensely than any other ally. I totally agree with Sadia, the potential, this is where defense strategy ties directly to diplomatic strategy. If the president wishes to engage Kim Jong-un again, Japan may be somewhat concerned about whether its equities would be protected during that conversation. But again, there's a foundation to build on, and the fact that Japan and very few other U.S. allies got in the door quickly and established channels of communication with the Trump administration would lead me to conclude, excuse me, it's Friday afternoon, that Japan can shape the way the second Trump administration thinks about the North Korea challenge.
Great. Sadia, you mentioned what lessons we should be learning from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Looking at that conflict more broadly and the role of space and what different actors are doing in the space domain to further their objectives, what can we pull forward in terms of the changing character of war and its applications for the security relationship between the United States and Japan?
Thank you so much for that question. I want to draw attention to a work that I just did with my colleague. It's called the Oxford Handbook of Space Security. It came out last year, and we were sort of looking at space security around the world and thinking about exactly these questions that were coming to the fore as the Ukraine war was progressing. And there were two lessons that we took away from it that I think are very important for us to think about in an era in which we have space innovation and also entrepreneurs as part of the changing landscape of the space industrial base. But there's no question that the U.S. is sort of leading on that. And Ukraine sort of becomes a very interesting test case for thinking about commercial entanglement in the space domain. What does it mean in peacetime? What does it mean in wartime? And I think Ukraine is an important test case for thinking about what it means on the ground. But one thing that we had as a takeaway was that it is very important, of course, to rely on the space industrial base, very important to rely on commercial space innovations, but that commercial entanglement also represents a challenge for national security purposes, and that sometimes can complicate unless and until there's complete clarity about who's controlling what assets in the ground. It also raises substantial questions about whether or not assets that are involved in a wartime or some sort of a contingency are legitimate targets for war. And this is also something that Putin has put on the table even in the Ukraine war. The other lesson that we sort of took away from this is that as the challenges mount in the space domain and as they begin to intersect and it dawns on people that the entire physical infrastructure is running from the Earth to space, is sort of all connected. And with the threat of nuclear weapons, the Outer Space Treaty itself, which has sort of governed the peaceful uses of outer space, that itself is under stress. There is a legitimate concern expressed by many of the collaborators that there could be a cascade of exits from the Outer Space Treaty per se. I think that would be a mistake, but that is another threat that I think we have to think about, and think about what that would mean to try to build the peaceful and sustainable uses of space as we were talking about earlier. That to me is a very important threat from a legal and policy perspective, because it's a real indicator of where we are headed in space per se.
Thank you. Yeah. Really, really helpful. This actually dovetails nicely with a question from the audience. This is from Victoria Sampson from the Secure World Foundation. She asks that one place where the United States and Japan might diverge in its threat perception is the U.S.'s recent pivot away from Ukraine and towards Russia. I'd be curious to the panelists' thoughts on how that might impact Japan's perceptions and implications for the bilateral security relationship with the United States.
Sure, I'll just step in and sort of broaden the aperture again, which I think is my primary role on this panel. I am the entertainment. These are the experts. I am the entertainment, to channel my inner Dr. Hamry. Let me just say that another important aspect of Japan's leadership role globally was its response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia for decades had a strategy, Japan for decades had a strategy to engage Russia economically and diplomatically to try to pull it away from China. And on a dime, former Prime Minister Kishida condemned the Russian invasion and really led the G7 in organizing its response to this fundamental threat to the rules-based international order. So fast forward to today, where it seems like the Trump administration is keen on changing the approach and engaging Russia more closely. That has strategic implications for Japan. I think initially the concern was that if this violation of Ukraine's sovereignty were to succeed, that would have implications for Asian security, primarily in the context of a Taiwan contingency. I think that's still true. But now I think there's a new dimension, which is if the Trump administration is engaging Russia, that conversation might not be limited just to Russia's security interests in Europe, but its security interests in Asia. And so during the Cold War, Japan's primary emphasis was working with the United States to prevent coercion and pressure from the Soviet Union. As we just discussed, Japan's strategy is primarily focused on the China and North Korea threats. Will it suddenly have to pivot again and focus on the potential for Russian coercion in Asia? That's a fundamental question, and one I think Japan has a right to worry about.
It's interesting to note that recent meetings in Japan with NATO Secretary General that Japan has expressed its interest in joining NATO efforts or supporting NATO efforts for any ceasefire arrangements in support of Ukraine. I don't think you would have seen this happen a few years ago in terms of Japan taking the lead on, or taking an initiative, I should say, and something that differs distinctly from U.S. attitudes and cooperation.
It's a notable development.
Melissa, may I just add one thing? I think, thank you, Victoria, for that question. Very important. And what I'd also like to put back on the table, along with the changed position of the United States, is also Japan, which is that Japan itself has, there's a complication there, which is that it is, of course, the military ally, steadfast, of the United States, but it's also in the world's largest trade pact with China. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So when we think about national interests, I think each country is sort of deciding how it can respond to the opportunities and threats and challenges that it sees for its national interests. So we're beginning to see some complications, both in the United States and also Japan. So for me, I think this is an extraordinary, if we all believe, and I believe this passionately, that the U.S.-Japan alliance is extremely important, this is a huge diplomatic opportunity. How do we shape it in a way to keep the momentum going, given these realities in mind? Which means that we need to concentrate, I would say respectfully, not just on the text of the treaty, but what precisely are the protections that the U.S. is offering Japan, and vice versa, so that it sort of makes sense in this, America First World Order, so to speak. But thank you for the question. Very helpful, yeah.
Thanks, Sadia. Staying on Ukraine, but also bringing in back the North Korea dimension, we have a question from Bob Vince at NNSS. With North Korea's support of Russia and Ukraine and Russia sharing space technologies with North Korea, where should expanded technology investments be made? I believe that's between the U.S. and Japan.
U.S. and Japan.
Yeah.
For me?
Sure.
All right. Well, we know there are well-established areas already in communications and early warning. Satellites, and Scott discussed the need to more rationalize those interests in orbiting constellations. With the Golden Dome initiative particularly, I can see this this interest in early warning descending down further into tactical intelligence and surveillance, and also into space-based interceptors. But this also would bring up a number of challenges and barriers that still have to be worked on as well.
Yeah.
You want me to go on with that, or?
Sure.
All right. All right. Partially, Scott referred to the need to harmonize requirements, timelines, budgetary issues. And this is true of defense programs generally, it'll be true of many other areas. This has been very difficult to do, even in long-established relationships with multinational programs with NATO allies. The U.S. and Japan are only developing this experience now, only in recent years, partially with joint development of the SM-32A interceptor missile, and now starting again on the GPI initiative, Glide Phase Initiative program, Glide Phase Interceptor, program. So there's a need to harmonize that. There's also a need to accelerate the pace of cooperation and research development in what has been often a painfully slow manner of evolution in joint programs in the past. And finally, there are barriers that institutional policy barriers that have been raised before: export control, technology release, information security. There has been substantial progress in all these areas in the last few years, but there is still a considerable ways to go.
If I can, Greg, just to tag on that, the Trump administration just released this week an executive order on acquisition to press DoD to lean further forward, particularly in cooperation with allies and partners. What opportunities do you see there to break through some of the barriers?
Direction from the top on increased partnership cooperation, I think hopefully will have a substantial effect on the reluctance of many parts of the bureaucracy to address in a more positive manner controls on technology, information disclosure, technology release. These ideas have been around for a long time and are always raised, but eventually the efforts break down because of foot dragging over particular agreements. But we've never had direction from the top before in the way I think we do now. So I think there is a real opportunity there. The same is true perhaps for requirements dialogues. There are opportunities now for U.S. Japan cooperation in several defense areas that have languished and may not be realized because of reluctance of various stovepiped bureaucracies to really engage in requirements dialogues and transition from research to program of record developments. So yes, all of that is welcome.
Great. Thanks very much. We're going to go to another question from the audience. This is from Marcos Reymayer Laura, who's a student from the George Washington University. What is the nature of trilateral ROC Japan U.S. cooperation in space? Is it grounded in defense, security, or is the plan to garner the development of civilian programs as well?
Well, I think there's a strong foundation to build on from the previous administration, which was the summit at Camp David in August of 2024, which really laid out a very comprehensive framework for trilateral security cooperation, which I think has the potential to incorporate all of the areas that were raised in the question. And I think that trilateral framework is critical to U.S. strategy, and we've seen signs just in the new administration, trilateral exercises and diplomatic engagements suggesting that will continue to be the case. But I think I would just conclude my response by saying that Japan, South Korea, bilateral relations are more important than ever. And obviously, there's a domestic political circumstance right now in South Korea, which is a complicating factor. But if you think about the deteriorating security environment, some uncertainty about where the United States is heading, and complementary interests and capabilities between Japan and South Korea, strategically, the logic is very compelling. So I would hope that bilaterally, there'd be more exploration of these issue areas also.
Great, thanks, Nick. Did you want to
Yeah, so I agree with what Nick is saying. Just to put a few more things on the table for you to think about, South Korea has really gotten into the civilian and commercial space race recently. We have something coming up in Asian security that I hope that people will take a look at, is about the rise of South Korea in the international relations of space. But I foundationally agree that the defense part of it is the one that we need to sort of think about, given the threats both within the region and then across. Depending on what the United States, how it wants to position itself in this game, I think we're still waiting to sort of wait and see. I would still say that there is a lot of momentum to build on for both Japan and South Korea, but it depends heavily on domestic politics, especially in the case of South Korea. So we will see where that actually goes. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Got another question from Yanni Nikas from Group W. Recent reports suggest that warfighting in space, that is, space assets against space assets, might be on the horizon. Does the United States need to take measures to ensure interoperability with its allies, like Japan, for space warfighting in ways that have been similar to cooperation on military operations within NATO?
Can I just give a quick answer, and then I'm hope that both of you will. I think that the U.S. Space Force setting down component field commands both in South Korea and Japan certainly helps towards that interoperability, certainly helps towards getting that organizational and training experience. And I think, was it today, yesterday, the Space Force has released its Space Force Doctrine #1, and it's very clear that space is a warfighting domain. So I think that under that doctrine, with our prominent allies in Asia, we are certainly going to be concentrating on that and looking particularly at space-to-space weapons, that is a given. Hopefully not kinetic, but certainly things that are non-kinetic are things that we need to watch out for and train for. So you asked earlier, and I just wanted to say in response to the earlier question, what is the area that you want to focus on? I think space domain awareness is extraordinarily important. This is the architecture that the U.S. needs to sort of build out with this, what does it mean? What will be, how will it be conceptualized? Who'll do what? How will it be executed on the ground? That needs to be put into place somehow, especially given that the doctrine has just come out. I haven't looked at it carefully, but I'm going to go study it now. But I think that that's where we're at the moment.
It's a good read and not too long.
Yeah.
Nick, anything you wanted to add on this? Great. We've got a few more minutes here in our session before we take a quick break. So just maybe a couple more questions from me. Sadia, I know you had an opportunity to work on the Council on Foreign Relations task force related to space. Recently, a report came out from the task force. What recommendations are there from the task force for U.S.-Japan cooperation?
So it's not focused primarily
Yep.
on Ishiba, this is like just general, but I think one of the things that is prominent is that it is pointing out China as a peer competitors. It is talking about the importance of global commons if you want to keep space sustainable. It is talking about the space industrial base, which I think is extremely important. And I think I'm constantly hearing when I come to this Washington, but not necessarily in the other Washington, that somehow there's a lot of uncertainty about where the U.S. is headed. But sitting out in the other Washington, as an academic, when I look here, I think it's very clear where the U.S. is headed. The U.S. has its national interests, sort of like we need to be either first or supreme or whatever it is in space. And in that context, I think it's very clear that it might be focusing and sees China as a peer competitor. So that's another area in which I think the report does kind of think about space diplomacy at a very foundational level. How do you stop space from blowing up in a way that is to the detriment of the space industrial base all around the world, particularly for the United States as a whole?
Thank you. Yeah. There's been a lot of discussion about tariffs recently. Maybe to start with Nick in terms of the broader bilateral relationship, in terms of the impacts on the tariffs. Of course, we've had the recalibration in the short term of the 90-day hold, but then we've seen the China tariffs move forward. What impact is that having on the overall bilateral relationship? And then maybe if I can turn to Greg to bring in the industrial cooperation lens for any impacts.
Sure. So obviously, it could affect the economic pillar of the U.S. Japan alliance. It sounds like there'll be some bilateral negotiations here in Washington next week, and hopefully we'll avoid another period of economic friction between the U.S. and Japan. So obviously, there's a direct economic impact. But I also think that the pressure the Trump administration is putting on China with respect to tariffs complicates Japan strategically. And just very briefly, I mean, Japan's China strategy in a nutshell is a delicate balancing act about deterring aggression based on uncertainties about China's military ambitions, but also having stable diplomatic ties to preserve a long history of economic interdependence with China. And I think that's true of other allies in Asia as well. And every time the United States, in either political party, when political leaders speak very openly in harsh tones about not only competing strategically with China, but potentially decoupling from China, that's a complicating factor for an ally like Japan. Japan is very willing to protect sensitive technologies, to work with the United States on export controls, and has demonstrated that already. But I think what's lacking in the U.S. approach to China is an appreciation of nuance and how important that is to Japan and other allies in the region. So of course there are economic consequences of tariffs, but there are broader strategic implications and complicating factors that I think people in this town should appreciate as well.
Thanks, Nick. Greg, did you want to apply maybe the implications that could be possible for industrial cooperation down the road?
Well, I think the narrow issue of tariffs, very little direct impact on industrial cooperation. The issues we're speaking of in joint programs stand largely apart any direct impact. The real issue, though, is how economic tensions, tariffs, other trade tensions affect the overall atmosphere of the relationship. And that's something goes back many years. You can go back to the trade wars of the 1980s, where it was a mantra of the time, repeated often since, that we cannot allow economic tensions to interfere with the security relationship, alliance cooperation there. Well, those are nice words, but in fact, when you look at acquisition and industry issues related to defense, these are by definition defense and economic programs, ones that can easily be politicized if mishandled, as indeed has been the case in the past with the infamous FF6 controversy of 30-some years ago. Now, on the positive side, I think the overall tenor of the U.S.-Japan alliance security relationship, alliance dialogue, is in a much better place than was the case 20, 30, let alone 40 years ago. We have finally largely outgrown the patron-client dynamics that characterized most of that time. There is a much more balanced dialogue, a far better perception of cooperation through partnerships. So, yes, of course, we're going to be concerned with trade tensions, tariffs, and pay attention to that. But I think the U.S.-Japan alliance relationship on the whole is much better positioned to weather these problems than was the case in the past.
Yeah. I'll just add a little bit, just following from this. One, I think the two countries, the U.S. and Japan, have learned a great deal through long duration projects related at least to space. International Space Station, ballistic missile defense. These are all very long duration projects that sort of span out over the course of years. So there is that community, there is that experience that can move forward into other domains as well. I think the really interesting thing today, what I think has happened under Trump, is that it is very clear now that economic security is deeply intertwined with defense security. There's just no question that that is an ethos that is also in the United States. So as the two countries sort of work out what works in each of their respective interests to sort of forge stability in space, I think that that's the starting point, and I think that's very certain. For me, that's a level of clarity that we have not really had before in some ways. And that makes it perhaps in some ways easier for the U.S. To be dealt with and to also deal with its allies going forward.
Great. And I think that usefully connects to the prior conversation in terms of how we reaffirm with our respective populations the value proposition of alliances, if there's that tie into economic security, if there are opportunities for industrial cooperation that it actually can lead to job growth.
Yes.
Perhaps that's a useful through line, an affirmative frame to approach how to renew and reinforce our alliance going forward. I really want to thank our terrific panelists today for a very wide-ranging conversation that I think usefully broadened the aperture in terms of the stakes, the opportunities, but also the risks ahead for the U.S.-Japan security relationship. And there's no better place to have this conversation than CSIS that is dedicated to having bipartisan conversations on the most consequential U.S. national security issues facing the nation, as well as our allies. So if you could please join me in thanking Nick, Sadia, and Greg for their terrific insights and great questions from the audience, too.
Okay, I think we're live. First off, just mandatory thank yous. So thank you to CSIS for putting together such a great event. Thank you to Kari for the chance to be part of her team. Thank you to the audience, everybody that came here on a rainy day in Washington, D.C., to our colleagues watching virtually around the world. It's good to see you in person or virtually. And of course, thank you to my distinguished panelists here. I'm honored to be joined by Taro Sato-san, President of Sentinel Space Alliance, Steve Jordan Tomacheski, Vice President at the Aerospace Industries Association in the United States, and finally, Colonel Trustee of the U.S. Space Force. It's great to have you all here. Just to sort of pick up with a couple themes from the previous discussions at today's event, I think there was a sort of widespread agreement that in the U.S. Japan alliance, space is sort of a critical element of that partnership and has been for years, and that partnership has been sustained across parties, across governments, and as I think Scott Pace called it, it's something of a relay game. And so there's always sort of more to do to take things forward, but I think today's panel on partnership, I think, will contribute to that significantly. And I think there was also a recognition in earlier panels that the relationship is wide-ranging. It touches on civil, it touches on commercial, it touches on national security, and that more and more those pieces are sort of all coming together in our space efforts together as the United States and Japan. And the importance of space to the alliance, I think, has been well recognized at the leadership level, including most recently with Prime Minister Ishiba visiting President Trump at the White House when space came up in the outcomes document. And I think that's a recognition of the progress that has been made in recent years, including under the leadership of Director Jun KAZEKI, who's in the front row. You guys can't see him on camera, but he's still here. And that includes a number of critical areas, things that I think exceed the level of ambition we've ever tried before, such as Japanese boots on the moon, alongside Artemis astronauts. I think that is a historic achievement, and I look forward to seeing that on television. I definitely won't be there myself. And then, of course, the announcement of collaboration on a low Earth orbit missile detection and tracking constellation. That also sort of exceeds the ambition of what we've done together on national security space by quite a lot. And so the collaboration required among government, among industry, I think will be unprecedented and difficult, but very exciting. Obviously, we're in a period of uncertainty on a number of key policy priorities. We had the testimony this week of the NASA Administrator nominee. One of the key discussion topics was the current Artemis architecture, Moon and then Mars. There was obviously a lot of interest on that in the Hill and where we're going. There was also discussion of Moon and Mars. And there have been discussions in the past about sort of Mars only or Mars plus asteroids. So there's a lot of uncertainty about sort of general progression. I think what's not uncertain, at least in my mind, is that for any sort of major ambitious U.S. goals vis-a-vis outer space, the U.S.-Japan partnership will be indispensable to making that happen. And I think that will stay true regardless of sort of where the final policy settings land on the U.S. side over the coming months. But that's enough out of me. You guys are here virtually and in person to get the perspectives of our panel. So what I'd like to do, just to sort of get the discussion going, is to ask you guys a very general question, and then feel free to sort of introduce yourselves and talk about your more general views if you would like. And so just to kick things off, I'd like to get a sense from each panelist about what do you see as the key priority initiatives and areas for the U.S.-Japan alliance in space moving forward. And we'll start with you, Colonel Sato.
Oh, thank you, Sean, and thank you very much for having me here today. Over the past several years, we have witnessed a remarkable progress in U.S.-Japan space cooperation. For instance, earlier this year, U.S. Space Domain Awareness Payload has launched with Japanese QZSS satellite. And since 2023, U.S.-Japan comprehensive dialogue on space has expanded beyond the intergovernmental discussion to include private sector participation. We both worked on that too. And also, there is a strong momentum on the new cooperation in missile defense in terms of space initiatives. So those represent significant forward steps for the U.S.-Japan space cooperations. Just last month, Japan established a new joint operations command, and at the same time, the U.S. side is also considering to delegating OPCON authority to U.S. Forces Japan. So in this evolving new commanding structure, space system must serve as the critical infrastructure for enabling seamlessly integrating bilateral operations. Given the geographical realities of the U.S. and Japan operating across the Pacific and operating within the contested A2AD environment, So we need capabilities such as long-range ISR, long-range communications, and the fully integrated air and missile defense system. So to achieve those the new challenges, relevant data from space and also through the space must be mutually usable and also have to be shareable. And every defense system has to be seamlessly communicatable between US and Japan. And these efforts will contribute to the US initiatives of the CJAB-C2 or Combined Joint All-Domain Command and Control, and also multi-domain defense force articulated in 2022, Japan National Defense Strategies. And to realize those things, I think the Allied by Design is very important to realize those JADC2 or Japan's multi-domain defense force thing. And to realize Allied by Design, we have to embody we have to structurally implement those new ideas. So Japan's Ministry of Defense and the US DoD has initiated a Space Cooperation Working Group since 2015, and the US Space Force and Japan Air Self-Defense Force has started a new framework of space engagement talks. And now we have DICAS, as we discussed in the previous discussion, in the industrial side. So we need to, I would emphasize that our priority must be through these existing framework or establishing new framework to synchronize the policy and the strategy and defining roles and missions between the two countries, and also coordinating or even synchronizing the standards and procedures of the military operation at the policy and the military level. That's the priority for me.
Thank you. I think that is so many good points in there to unpack. I want to jump on all of them. I'll hold myself off, but I'll just say to your point about seamless operations, I think that's such a good point. And for MOD as a sort of newer space entrant, I think, to military space, it implies a lot of requirements that are actually rather difficult if you're going to work with the United States, who has a much longer history of operating, and that includes being able to support your self-defense force operators, throughout Japan, in an operational sense. It means being able to sort of use US standards and talk to us in real time. I think it means acquiring, for lack of a better word, hard power that contributes to alliance defense, and should defense fail, or should deterrence fail, being able to defend the alliance successfully against any aggression. That's obviously a high bar for some of the things like ISR constellation, and then down the line, the missile detection and tracking constellation. And so I'm looking forward to seeing further kind of military-to-military engagement moving forward to help advance that. So, Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Sean, and thank you very much for CSIS for pulling this event together. I'm Steve Jordan Tomaszewski. I'm the Vice President for Space Systems at the Aerospace Industries Association. So at AIA, we represent nearly 300 companies across the aerospace and defense industry here in the United States. One of the things that we've done recently is go out to all of our companies and pull together a consensus document about what priorities they think that especially governments could do to better enable industry. It's a very exciting time right now in the space industry. We have some major technological changes that are happening. Things like proliferating constellations of satellites, where you used to might only have a handful of satellites. We have hundreds or thousands that are getting operated these days. We also have the cost of launch has been drastically decreasing with a lot of new launch capabilities coming online, and launch has traditionally been a bottleneck for the space industry. But one of the things that we heard from all of our companies at AIA was the importance of international cooperation and making sure that government and industry are working together to achieve shared goals. I think it's very important right now for governments to listen to industry. I think there's been some great examples of that recently in the U.S. and Japan relationship, and hoping that we can continue that important dialogue.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Colonel Trustee, same question to you, please.
Yeah. So, Lieutenant Colonel Trustee, I'm over in the Directorate of International Affairs, more specifically the Space Division. We're still pretty young, about 5 years old, about as old as the Space Force. And like I said, I am Space Force. I know I don't look like it in my kind of Air Force blues, but the uniform is coming, hopefully in the fall, fingers crossed. If I say it online, it'll be true. But the one good thing is, us kind of being the last panel to go back, I had a chance to listen to a bunch of brilliant people up here, and I wrote down a lot of notes. So I think I may have learned more than what I'm probably going to put out today, but I think some of the things that we really looked at is just being important is enhanced space situational/domain awareness. We really need to focus on that. That's one of the things that the Space Force is really focusing on too as well, is how can we get better at it? I'll talk a little bit kind of after this about General Saltzman and his competitive endurance and kind of how all this stuff kind of relates to it. There we go, got to throw that in. But then also we're going to look at kind of space defense cooperation. How can we get better at missile defense? How can we get better at protecting things on orbit? Those things are really important, especially since, kind of cliche, but space is, competitive, congested, contested, and all these types of things. But it is really important, and you can't do any of that if you don't know what's up there. And so space domain awareness is critically important. The other thing about that is just collaboration on civil space missions. And so earlier we talked about Artemis. Sometimes that's kind of the beginning of things, being able to get together, maybe do some RDT&E, looking at scientific things, and then come up with a common goal together. It's maybe not the easiest goal, but if you're looking at going to Mars or you're looking at, doing things on the moon, maybe that's a start. As we continue to go, we're looking at strengthening international norms and standards for space. These things are important. We talked about earlier of, some wild things going on in space. General Gutlein in his testimony talked about dogfighting in space. I've been in the Space Force in the military for 20 years, 5 years in the Space Force. I never thought that we would get here where we're talking about dogfighting in space. I can't wait for the Top Gun movie to come out. It's going to be interesting about space Top Gun, but those things are going to be important for us to take a look at. And then we talked about capacity building and training. Those are the things I think that we can really do together. One of the things that we look at within our division is we look at foreign military sales, we look at international armament agreements, how we can kind of make those connective tissues work. We also look at training. How can we get our partners into our training? We have folks going to Johns Hopkins, we have folks going out to Schriever Space Scholars. These things are really, really important as we develop our relationships. The other thing, I'm glad you brought up Allied by Design, with Futures Command standing up. Oh, it's going to be, I can't wait for that. And hopefully if it meets what it's going to say, being able to bring our partners in from the beginning and you kind of address security concerns, interoperability problems from the very beginning and have you have these tough conversations. We continue to have these tough conversations already. When we have Air Marshal Godfrey, he's our assistant CSO, 3-star British officer on the space staff. Never thought that would happen. But he is making us rethink things in different fashions. There's also things that's been going around where we've been talking about, hey, we need to look at how we're classifying things. Are we over-classifying? How can we bring our partners into this? These are things that we have to talk about. And if we don't put people in uncomfortable situations to be able to do that, like having Air Marshal Godfrey sitting in a meeting and me say, hey, sir, I'm sorry, we may have to make you leave. That's not a conversation you want to have with a 3-star who has the ear of the 4-star. These are the things that we're battling with now as the 4-star, or as the Space Force. And then again, congratulations to QZSS. We did have the Indo-PACOM commander out there. It was great for Brigadier General Massilier to be out there, as well as the assistant our assistant director in SAF-IA, General Mills, was out there as well, being able to do that launch. And so that was a great collaborative moment for us to be able to get out there and do that. And so thank you for that. And then the last thing I wanted to hit was just the A2AD problem. Some of the priorities that we're really looking at as far as the Space Force, it's like space control. How can we do that as far as being able to, that problem set. I was out at Ramstein, and that was one of the big problem sets that we have. When we look at what we did in Afghanistan, and people saw that, hey, once you let the U.S. in, it is hard to get us out. We are the unwanted guests. And A2AD is that problem that we have to solve, and space control may help with that. The other thing that's a top priority for us as the Space Force that we're looking at is space domain awareness. And then the last thing is, how can we shorten the long-range kill chain? And I think you kind of hinted to that before, where we have overhaul along comms, space control. How can we do these things to be able to let our allied forces be able to get in there?
Well, thank you. And there's so much to sort of grab onto there. Just one I'll touch on right now is actually hearkening back to what Kari said earlier, which is an opportunity for Japan as it thinks about its own defense posture to leapfrog. And you touched on sort of the foundational importance of space domain awareness. And I think that is sort of case in point where Japan can think about, what worked for the US, what didn't work, what is commercially available, and how can I bring all that together to sort of build a very comprehensive, for lack of a better word, battle management system for space that supports a number of functions that Japan is going to need, and to do it in a way that leverages the most advanced technology and also can talk to the United States in real time. So I really appreciate you touching on that. Okay, we're going to move into sort of person-by-person questions now, and then we'll move to audience questions after that. So starting with you, Taro-san, based off your very broad range of opportunities in the Japanese government, now the private sector, where do you think that the Space Security Alliance should seek to be 10 years from now?
Yes, thank you for the question, Sean. When we look ahead to the next 10 years, I believe Japan's national security space posture will look very different from what it is today. Right now, Ministry of Defense is operating just 2 defense SATCOM, in addition to the CSIS, Cabinet Satellite Intelligence Center, is operating multiple intelligence satellites. But 10 years from now, Japan will likely be running ISR constellations, and Minister of Defense will be operating multiple secured SATCOM, and for the Minister of Defense, probably Air Self-Defense Force or Air Self-Defense Force will be operating missile tracking constellations. And for sure, for the SDA, Self-Defense Force will be operating not only geo-based large SDA satellite, but also much more smaller and maneuverable SDA satellite as well. And more importantly, by the time Japan Air Self-Defense Force will be transformed to Japan Air and Space Self-Defense Force. And for sure, U.S. space posture will be much more sophisticated as well. Those are those things going to happen next 10 years. And this brings us to the question of how to integrate those new systems between the U.S. and Japan. And I think I like .mil-PF framework, which is from, I think, DOD, and doctoring organizations, training, material, leadership, personnel, and facilities. And this .mil-PF framework may provide strategic direction for future effort between U.S. and Japan. For doctoring, as you discussed, the U.S. Space Force announced a new doctoring last week. And I think Japan also needs to define a clear vision and the direction of its space doctrine as well. And for the organizations in both countries, authorities and the responsibilities over space are spread across the multiple agencies. And the greater integration on both sides is something we will have to work toward. And training leadership and the personnel, I think in these areas, Japan might need the most support from the U.S. The human capital issue is the one with the biggest issue Ministry of Defense is facing right now. And the material, we will need to strengthen U.S. and Japanese space industrial base, and also promote more robust industrial cooperation between the two countries. And the facility, we have to figure out what kind of capability can be operated by military side. At the same time, what can be sourced from commercial side. This issue also brings to the critical issue of cybersecurity in both the government system and also the commercial system as well. That's something we have to work on next 10 years, I think.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate the perspective. Steve, next question is up for you. AIA has been a leader in convening a lot of these industry dialogues back when I was in government and now out of government. It's delightful to see that some of these are continuing. So what do you see, from your perspective, as the role of industry moving forward in keeping the partnership advancing in the commercial sense, given the lack of, for now, a government-to-government dialogue track of comprehensive dialogue?
I think it's important to put this in context of, a couple of years ago, there was a lot of discussions happening government to government between the U.S. and Japan. The Comprehensive Dialogue in Space was one of those venues, right, where you had interagency components from both U.S. and Japanese governments participating. But there was an opportunity that happened a few years ago to actually allow industry to participate in those discussions as well. And I think that's incredibly important. And the thought behind that was, if industry is there at the table when we're trying to figure out better ways to collaborate, we can take advantage of all great ideas that are happening across industry. And at the end of the day, when when the government is buying a new space system, it's getting built by our industrial base. And so really hoping that those types of discussions will continue moving forward, and that strong interagency coordination and direction from the comprehensive dialogues in space in the past was extremely productive. So as a trade association, we're also looking at ideas of how can we be helpful to facilitate some of those conversations between government and industry. And I think Dr. Pace brought up earlier the importance to not just have one nice big get-together a year, but making sure there's actual follow-through. So that accountability piece is a challenge. And I think if you have industry that can follow through on government accountability mechanisms, looking at new ways to improve what's already happening, that's just going to make it better.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And that's such a good point about accountability, to make sure we don't just have a nice meeting and then, hey, I'll see you next year in Tokyo or Washington, depending on whose turn it is. And then Colonel Trustee, last question to you before we move into audience questions. From your perspective, your perch, I should say, in the U.S. Space Force, how do you see military-to-military ties progressing with the soon-to-be Air and Space Force of Japan, or Self-Defense Force, I should say, and in particular on certain programs like, say, space domain awareness or vis-a-vis the LEO missile detection and tracking constellation?
No, thank you. And so I think we start to look at this, there's a lot of things that we have in common. I was looking at the Japan's SIS, and I looked at the U.S. Space Force like mission and vision. And those things are very similar, where we want to both protect our national interests, in and through space. Like, those things are really important. And the fact that, first and foremost, the JASDF is looking to do a name change and add space to it, changes your vision, it changes your perception on things. It changed the way our perception was when we, left the Air Force and became our own Space Force, just like when the Air Force left the Army Air Corps to become the Air Force. It changes your perception. It changes the way you finance and you fund things. And so, for that, I think we get a lot aligned because we look at a shared threat perception in the Indo-Pacific. We look at what China may be doing in the South China Sea. We look at some of the things that they're doing to build up their space forces. Those things are important, that we're along that same line and that we're kind of thinking the same there. We look at the alignment of our strategic interests. Both countries believe in a free and open Indo-Pacific. We look at Japan as leaders, one of the leaders there in the Indo-Pacific. And having that balance and being able to have free trade lanes, having to, be able to work together. We look at the launches that we've had. You were talking about in 10 years, where are we going to be at? Well, I'm hoping that Space Force of Japan is fully integrated with, the Japan Air and Space Force, that we're doing more launches where, with CSIS and SDA, particular payloads, things like that. Like, that's what I'm looking for. That's what I'm looking forward to in the next 10 years. And then also, Japan's growing space capabilities. It means a lot when you say, hey, you know what, we're going to start our own space operations group. And now you're looking at how can we develop and train these people, these expertise? How can we do exchanges with countries like the U.S. or, South Korea or any other countries to be able to bring in these different experts to look at processes, procedures, to look at interoperability? You're looking at those things to how we can become better, because when the fight starts, you get all that stuff out of the way early, and that's important. And then lastly, just being able to focus on, for the Space Force, we talked about General Saltzman's speech. We talk about it quite a bit, that we cannot do this without our allies and partners. It is critical to what we do. I work with them every single day. I look at their professionalism. I look at the knowledge that they bring and the capabilities that they're able to bring. That's one thing that we look at, especially when we're doing like foreign military sales or we're doing building partner capacity in there. When we look at our partners just don't want to be, carried along in it. They want to be able to bring capability. And so many of our partners are doing that. They're bringing capability and they're bringing expertise and having us look at things differently than we've ever looked at it before. And then we kind of talk about the constellation. Well, a lot of that's kind of like TBD right now. As we continue to kind of work through like those things I was talking about as far as security and operability. Yeah, some hurdles, but I think because we may have the political will, we can probably get through some of those things. One of the things that we're looking at with the space SDA is that, you know, the way they kind of do fielding, right now they're still working on tranche 1. You know, so hopefully we can kind of get to some of those further tranches so that we can get further capability out to Japan so we can make sure that we're meeting their interests as well. Because, you know, the partnership's definitely a two-way street.
Yeah, I really appreciate all the perspectives, and just as a sort of editorial comment, piggybacking off an earlier discussion point to your notion about launching the payloads, you know, from Japan in the future, potentially Japanese payloads launching from the United States. This is the exact kind of discussion we had when we were talking about a technology safeguards agreement, or TSA, between the United States and Japan, was to enable the kind of collaboration we're already seeing. For example, in the past, we've had U.S. national security payloads launching from British soil on U.S. space launch vehicles. And I think, you know, introducing and thinking about a resilient allied launch posture and launch base, I think is an important concept moving forward, including for the United States, where we have a ton of launches, but a lot of it is concentrated in Florida, and a lot of hurricanes go through there. So in the future, this may be a very important, I think, concept to keep exploring. Thanks.
100%, and I love launch. I've had a chance to do it on the East Coast and the West Coast, and it is amazing. So.
All right, well, we've got a little bit of time now. There's a lot of good questions coming in from the audience, so I'll do my best to accommodate all of them. We may not get there in time, but we'll try. The first one I would like to move to is from an anonymous viewer of today's event. It says, what should information sharing between the U.S. and Japan look like for shared/collaborative SSA and SDA capabilities? So just open question in the group, whoever would like it.
I'll start. So I think there's a lot of dimensions of information sharing at the end of the day. We've talked about, even today, we've talked about challenges of sharing classified information between our countries, barriers that are currently there to include kind of the security screening, cybersecurity concerns. So I also think that there's a lack of kind of information networks that are just able to do a lot of the space-specific collaboration at the end of the day. I think initiatives like the Combined Space Operations Initiative that was discussed earlier can set some of that groundwork and that framework to figure out how to fix some of those gaps. But the other thing that I think we still need to work on collectively is information sharing between government and industry. Our adversaries aren't looking at currently deployed satellite constellations in a lens of, oh, that's a government potential target, and here is a commercial satellite, therefore we won't even look at it. It gets really brought together there. And for companies that are operating constellations that have their own operations centers, we have to have mechanisms in place in order to share information and threat-specific information with industry. There's some initiatives to do that out there. There's not enough. But I also think it's not just for the operational day-to-day information sharing between what threats are coming at you, but looking at development of future systems and looking at what you can do to potentially safeguard your future space capabilities against advanced threats in the future. That's something that could also be improved.
Yeah, that's such a good point. You got me thinking about, even in the U.S., we're still working through these issues of commercial integration and what does the Defense Department and the Space Force in particular owe to, say, a commercial operator it's relying upon if they come under attack in a crisis or conflict. And that is, I think, an important area for Japan to also study, particularly as MOD builds out its military forces in space further, including through mechanisms like private finance initiatives where you're explicitly relying upon some commercial consortium to provide you sort of key enabling space technologies and capabilities if they come under attack in a crisis involving hostile neighbor. What will the Air and Space Self-Defense Force do for those commercial providers of that critical service? And I think that's actually a really good area to exchange lessons learned. But please, other panelists, would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, at least I think I know an office for that. International Affairs Space Division, I think, can help with that. Yeah, I mean, we do have some good folks in there. One of the things that we look at is, we start with agreements. That's kind of like the basis, and that's what our office is really good at. We have master negotiators in there. They go out, we talk to our allies, we talk to our partners, and we start with agreements like space domain awareness agreements. From those space domain agreements, like you talked about Kazeki-san, was like becoming partners in CSPO. That's an important step, because once you become a partner in CSPO, like you have the 4-star right there, at your will to be able to kind of talk through issues, barriers that you may be, running into. And you have not just that, you have the power of other countries right there to kind of talk through those things. Some of the next things that we look at after, getting involved into CSPO is Operation Liquid Defender. Are you getting into these exercises as part of that next step so that we can train together? Once we start to really kind of train together and beginning to share information, we're starting to build that trust. We're starting to, go through real life scenarios of things that could potentially happen. And then we're learning to fail together. That's also the important part, because so many people, as we go through these things, don't want to fail. But in order for us to get better, in order for us to learn, in order for us to go where we need to go, as far as whether it's information sharing, technology sharing, whether it's operating together, we have to learn how to fail together. And these exercises are great at doing that.
Sure. For talking about information sharing in military affairs, just Colonel's talking about SSN and SDA. Yes, Japan, the U.S. Space Force is exchanging SDA information day by day. And also by 2026, Japan will launch the new SDA satellite. Mm-hmm. And I think SDA cooperation is going to be much more deeper and deeper. And also, a few months ago, the Japanese venture company, Astroscale Japan, got awarded for the new demonstration of smaller SDA satellite. Yeah. And we are many Japanese startups are also participating to the SDA or SSA operations. As Steve mentioned, so we have to think about government to government or military to military information sharing framework, and also government to commercial sectors information sharing scheme. And also, if you look at the missile defense area, Japan's missile defense structure is based on the U.S. early warning satellite system. So U.S. early warning satellite information is providing to the Japanese missile defense C2 system, and then ground-based radar system track the missile and send back to U.S., send back the information to U.S. again. Yeah. So those are the examples of the information sharing in military level for the SSA, SDA, and missile defense. And talking about the future information sharing, especially for the missile defense, so the system is going to be much more integrated in the future, especially when we have to respond to hypersonics threat. Mm-hmm. And information sharing is going to be more, we have to look for more continuous information sharing in the future, coming future.
If maybe I could just piggyback on that, because I think missile warning and missile defense are really areas that the United States and Japan can collaborate on in the future. In the United States right now, there's a lot of questions about what the future Golden Dome initiative is going to look like, but really, the Golden Dome could be a golden opportunity for collaboration at the end of the day.
Great.
And whether that's collaborating between U.S. and Japan, between government and industry, taking advantage of all these great new, commercial technologies that are out there, I think that it's something that is going to be a main focus of both of our countries for the foreseeable future. Mm-hmm.
Well, I really love that Steve did that, because it also preempts another question on Golden Dome, and broader question to the panel then is specifically to Golden Dome, which is appearing to be a sort of system of systems, right, with sort of different capabilities and potentially even different parts of the DoD sort of responsible for acquiring it. We obviously have a long history of missile defense collaboration with Japan. They're probably our most advanced partner in a number of ways, including the 2A project, but also with hypersonic defense. What would you guys see as sort of key areas for Japan to focus on, or present to the United States proactively as an area that Japan should try to work with the United States on for Golden Dome?
Man, that's a tough one. Good question. Because we're still trying to figure out what Golden Dome is going to look like. And so I think it's hard to say what we would probably need from our partner in something that we're not even sure what it's going to look like yet. But I mean, from what we've had, from before is, we've always done this thing called dual phenomenology, where we have a ground site and we have something in space, trying to see if there's anything maybe coming over the poles to hit North America. But I think it starts there. It probably starts at the basics of saying like, hey, what type of ground warning sites do I have? And then what type of on-orbit assets do I have? And what type of layered defense can I add to that to help protect the country? And who else do I want to get buy-in? Because that's one of the things I think that we look at is almost kind of like a lattice structure of, if I have more people involved in it, what we look at kind of like WGS or something, Australia, US, you have more people involved into a project, an adversary may be less likely to attack that. And so I think maybe having, more people, maybe at a regional view of, and starting with kind of your ground and your space and see what other layers you can add to that, could probably help with the initiative of being able to do missile defense. But again, I think from just a US perspective, because we don't know what we don't know yet, and I know it's still going through, OSD, and I know we're meeting and things about it, but just trying to figure out what that looks like is tough right now.
Yeah, please.
So at this point, we don't know much about the detail about what's the Golden Dome look like. But so U.S. and Japan have been working on the missile defense cooperation for a long time. And SM3 Block 2A and, as I said, information sharing between U.S. missile defense C2 and Japanese C2 system is also the examples. I don't know much about how much Japan can contribute for the kind of like global scale U.S. missile defense posture. But so one of the advantage of the U.S. Japan missile defense cooperation is that, so Japan is going to play a regional responsibility in a way that that's going to contribute to U.S. Global posture. So I think even for the Golden Dome, I don't know how much Japan can contribute to U.S. global posture of that, but regionally, Japan can contribute to cooperate with the U.S. for Golden Cooperation, Golden Dome.
Golden Cooperation.
So,
I feel like I am hearing a report title being born right now for CSIS. Well, Steve, unless you want to jump in, we'll change gears to another really good question from our participants. The question from an anonymous participant is, where do the U.S. and Japan have complementary strengths in their industrial bases so that we're not duplicating capabilities? And how do you think about supply chain resilience and diversification?
I'll start. For supply chain at large, I think this is a major thing we're going to be talking about for years to come. The space supply chain in particular is very specialized. It's very high technology sector, of course. But what happens is when you have very specialized components that you need to put on satellites and on launch vehicles, it can take a long time to build those. And with those technological advances that we're seeing, like proliferation of satellites, the industry right now is struggling to increase manufacturing capacity across the board. I think in space, if you look back the last 10 or 20 years, whenever we've talked about supply chain issues, it's really been a focus on cybersecurity and kind of making sure that our information is protected, making sure that the bad guys aren't getting their hands on very, very critical technologies that we're developing. But I think moving forward, it's going to be very important for both the U.S. and Japan to find ways to increase the manufacturing capacity and to start manufacturing at scale. I think that when we're looking at national security specific issues, then it could make a lot of sense for both of our governments to make investments into the supply chain and in manufacturing capacity. We're starting to see that in space, but it's nowhere near kind of other parts even of the kind of across the aerospace and defense sectors.
And just to add on to that, I think it's just an exercise too of getting over hurdles and then incentivizing. Are we incentivizing some of these startups here to work together? Are we doing, kind of tech transfers? Are we trying to help each other's industrial base learn from some of the processes and procedures that each country has in place? If there's something that the U.S. does really well, and like you said, like Japan does really well, are we bringing those things together? Are we bringing those two, kind of people together? And so, as you kind of talked about with the supply chain, as long as I think we have the political will to do it, and then as long as we're able to get over some of those hurdles like, the interoperability piece, whether it's the regulation piece, those type things we'll have to kind of look at and see if we can streamline that to make it a little bit easier for the companies to kind of collaborate to each other.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think it is also important that to differentiate redundancy and duplication and redundancy. So between US and Japan, we don't need to duplicate the same capability, but redundancy is also important as well. And as Steve mentioned, both countries are planning to launch hundreds of satellites in LEO, and production capacity and having same production capacity in US Japan might be also important. So redundancy and duplication, we have to differentiate those two.
That's a great point. Next question up is a little bit different. This one comes from Isha Gupta at Georgetown University. And Isha is asking, is there a potential for a new joint ISS to be launched given its decommission in 2030?
So the International Space Station, the current plan for the United States right now is to be able to support that through 2030. The follow-on to the International Space Station, NASA's big program for that right now is called Commercial LEO Destinations, or Commercial Low Earth Orbit Destinations. And the big question is to see what companies can do, what the commercial industry can do to be part of the next generation of space stations. So I think this is a great opportunity right now. There's actually a lot of companies out there that are paying for and building their own space stations. But we also just want to make sure that we don't have a gap between capabilities. We want to make sure that we have these new commercial LEO destinations up in space before we're retiring the International Space Station. That consistency is key. We're learning so much from the International Space Station, from basic science and research, and starting to look at manufacturing capabilities as well. So that type of capability is going to be essential, and both the US and Japan are heavily invested in the International Space Station today. And it's going to be really important that this next generation of stations with this government and industry collaboration is done seamlessly.
And just to piggyback off your really good point there, Steve, Japan has already played a big role in the CLD program. A number of the proposals that are out there, they're competing both in CLD phase 1 and then probably in CLD phase 2, have Japanese financial investment and Japanese hardware involved. And so although it won't, the structures governing this won't look anything like the ISS in terms of having an intergovernmental agreement and a treaty, I think the industrial collaboration that's already occurring and that will continue to occur is very important. And then once the CLDs are operational, the ability of the US and Japan to leverage not just space, but other industrial areas to make these CLDs successful in a commercial sense is absolutely crucial. And I think there's a ton of areas where US-Japan collaboration that is not space right now will become space. And we can see that in things like pharmaceuticals, computing, and potentially other areas. And sorry, I didn't mean to hijack you guys responding, but feel free to jump in.
No, Steve, masterclass it.
Masterclass, nice.
There you go.
Okay, we are starting to run a little bit low on time. I think we have time for one more question. What I would like to ask you guys is, export control, tech release, sort of related issues have come up a number of times today as a sort of a theme of challenges to be overcome, approaches to be rethought, and sort of matching the policies to the implementation. I think in many cases the policies are fine, it's the implementation not getting done, or sort of foot dragging or resistance at sort of lower levels. I'd love your guys' thoughts as you guys have had a range of experiences. How do you see this challenge in the context of the U.S.-Japan alliance in space?
So for export control reform, I think it's really important that we continue to look at technologies and identify opportunities where we can lower barriers and regulatory burdens and really enable industry to thrive. Overall, the United States, our aerospace and defense industry is one of our top net exporting industries. We're able to work with international partners all around the world, and folks want our technology. That's the great news. But the challenge is with new types of space technologies just changing almost on a daily basis, the mechanisms in place just take a long time to go through and make some of those changes. But with the new administration here, I think that offers us some new opportunities to look at things like space-specific export control reform. At the end of last year, there was an opportunity for industry in the United States and Japan to provide inputs through the State Department and the Department of Commerce on some new proposed ideas. And I think that is just needs to happen on a more regular basis, just because of what's happening in space. But at large, it's always a good idea to look at regulations and what types of things that the industry, that the industry could better take advantage of. There's also areas that providing some additional regulations or some regulatory certainty could better enable industry. One thing that comes to mind there is what we will sometimes call mission authorization for novel space activities. So when we're talking about servicing other satellites on orbit, whether we're talking about in-space manufacturing, even active debris removal, there's not a good framework in place for the United States to be able to provide regulatory certainty to companies to help make some of those strategic investments. So, and then once we get to the international piece, if you wanted to have a mission where a Japanese satellite was looking to get deorbited by an American servicing satellite, those types of frameworks are really nascent right now. So but if governments both from the U.S. and Japan and worldwide, stepped up, were able to provide some clarity on some of those regulations, that would really help to provide that certainty to industry and be a very clear signal to investors to make to put new private capital into those types of markets.
And then one of the things that's a starting point in our office is that we manage the DAF's position on exports, whether it's industry or whether it's Department of Defense. And so that's one thing that's great about working in our office is that we're kind of like the front door for all these things. And, I'm available to anyone that wants to come out and talk about those types of things because we do have people that do that. And we're all about trying to, like I said, for military sales, building partner capacity. And that starts in our office. And so we have the people and expertise to be able to do that. The second thing I think that's also important here is like the allied by design. If we can start from the beginning and get people on the ground floor and start working together, then we can hopefully get some of those hurdles, whether it's commercial and or whether it's our allies and partners.
So if we are talking about export controls, that reminds me the discussion in the last comprehensive dialogue, track 2.0. So in that discussion, U.S. and Japanese private sector get together and discuss about actually export control as well. And one of the conclusion was I think for maybe next time, U.S. Japan can get together again and discuss and study about what's the real issue for the private companies, and bring those issues to the track 1.5 discussion. And in that way, government and the private sector can cooperate for overcoming the export control issues. That's for me.
And we are, unfortunately, almost out of time. And before we wrap up, I guess, a quick lightning round. Is there anything else that we did not touch on today that you would really like to sort of convey to the audience here today about the future of U.S.-Japan collaboration in outer space?
I think we touched them.
You solved all the problems already. Well, a couple administrative notes then. First, for those that are able to join in person, there will be a reception afterwards, so please attend if you're able. Also, shameless plug on the export control topic. I previously authored a paper with CSIS on this, so I welcome your review and your hate mail accordingly. And I think with that, we will go ahead and wrap up here. Thank you for your time, everyone, and have a great one.